They came home at dusk, when the light went thin and gray in the notch between the hills and the steam over the hot pools rose like ghost breath, and Winterfell's banners stirred in a wind that carried the taste of iron and wood smoke. Ned rode at the head with his cloak thrown back and the weight of 3 children and a whole troubled realm behind his eyes. The gatehouse had the look of old stone grown from the earth itself. Torchlight pooled on the frost-stiffened cobbles. The portcullis rattled upward with a clatter and a groan that he had not heard in too long. He could smell the place before he saw it. The wet warmth of the springs running beneath the walls, the tanner's tannic bite, ash from the great hall's fires, straw, horse, the faint nettle tang from the mews, and a sweetness that was only here, only home, something in the lichen on the walls or the breath of the godswood. It hurt in a clean way. He had not thought to come back like this. The boys at the gate straightened when they saw him. He knew their faces even when they hid behind beards and helms. Tall Tom Barleycorn with the broken nose he'd had from the first, Chet with the white scar across his cheek, Lou of the Mill, a new lad whose hand shook as he saluted. "Lord Stark," Tom said, and his voice cracked with a relief he tried to hide. "We, Ser Roderick has the hall ready. Maester Luwin sent for bread and salt." "Good." Ned swung out of the saddle. The cold bit his knees when his boots hit the stones. He took the bite for proof he was awake and reached to help the nearest of the southern children from his horse. Tommen blinked in the torchlight and clung to the saddle just a moment before he took Ned's hand. He had a face that ought to have been made only for laughter. In a place with gentler weather, he might have grown fat and contented, fond of dogs and storybooks. There was chapping around his mouth where the wind had punished him. Myrcella dismounted with more grace than should have belonged to a child who had ridden so far. She put her hand to the pommel, placed her boot proper, and dropped, her skirts catching a breath of steam. Her hair shone pale as new straw. Her chin was lifted. She was frightened, and she would not show it. Joffrey hit the ground with a scowl and the snap of an impatient breath, as if the cold offended him personally. "Finally," he said, "a drafty pile of stones in the end of the world." He raked the groom who came for his horse with a glance that had made men step aside in other places. Here the groom merely took the reins and said nothing. He was a small, square fellow who had stripped and bridled horses in this yard since before Joffrey had been born. Ned saw the moment the boy, no, the prince, and the word felt ill-fitting as a borrowed boot, understood that his look had fallen on stone. Joffrey flushed and bit his lip. Pride is a poor cloak against the wind, Ned thought, and then reproached himself for the uncharity. He was holding children as surety. Honor had never asked him for this before, and the heart tree would know. Theon Greyjoy swung his leg over and dropped nimbly, grinning wide, the same reckless flash he'd worn since boyhood. He clapped a hand to Joffrey's shoulder as if they were stablemates rather than a ward and a hostage on ground that did not belong to either of them. "Cheer up, lion cub," Theon said. "There are worse places to sharpen your teeth. The ale is strong, and the girls have more sense than southern pigeons." Joffrey jerked away, eyes hot. "Do not touch me." Theon's grin flickered. He let his hand fall. "You'll find we touch what we please this far north," he said lightly, but his glance flicked to Ned, question in it. Ned gave him the smallest shake of the head. "Not now." Arya slid out from behind one of the gateposts as if she'd been carved there. She had grown leaner since they fled south and back again, a stripling's angle to her where there had been a child's roundness. The wind had reddened her nose, and there was a smear of something on her cheek as if she had wiped away a tear with a dirty glove and forgotten it. A shadow whipped past her, gray-brown and quick, and Ned's breath caught until he saw the swish of Summer's tail and the way Bran's wolf stopped and looked up at him without fear. Summer's muzzle was dusted with snow. His eyes were stranded gold, deep and intent. He smelled the Lannister children one by one and sneezed. "Back," Arya said, though there was pride in her voice when the direwolf fell to heel. She looked at Joffrey full, not flinching, not lowering her eyes, and there was something of lioness temper in that look. "Welcome to Winterfell," she said in a tone that made it both welcome and warning. Sansa came slower. She had bound her hair in the northern way. The auburn made a rich knot over her collar and spilled to her shoulder in a twist of copper. She paused halfway across the yard and stood very straight, as if a court watched her and not only the folk who loved her. When she moved again, she moved with the particular care of someone who knows each step will be studied. The light touched her face and showed an old bruise's shadow that would fade entirely soon but had not yet. Ned saw her see Joffrey, and the heat rise in her cheeks, and the apology and pleading both that came into her eyes when she turned them toward him. He did not need the gods to tell him that pain would be made of this. "Inside," he said gently, "you are all chilled. Bread and salt, and then whatever else must be said." The great hall lifted out of the darkness like a belly of flame. Flags moved in the draft. Grey Field and White Direwolf, Umber's roaring giant in chains, Manderley's merman, Tallheart's trees, the flayed man that Roose Bolton sent to remind and unsettle as was his way. The walls sweated. The old stones drank warmth and gave it back. When the door thumped shut, the roar of the outside wind cut clean away as if someone had drawn a knife. Catelyn was there at the high table. She held herself with that bone-drawn composure she used when the stakes were too high for tears. Her eyes went first to Arya and Sansa, as was right, and she touched them both quickly, checking with her fingers what her eyes had told her. All their parts where they should be, no new hurts. Only then did she look at the children of the South. Myrcella dropped the smallest curtsy a lady might give to a lord in his own hall. "My lady," she said. The words were steady, and in them was the kind of courtesy that had been beaten into her at court until it had become a shield. Tommen tried to imitate his sister and stumbled on the angle of it. Catelyn reached out without thought and steadied him by the elbow. "You are most welcome under this roof," she said. Cost her something, Ned knew. She gave no sign of the cost. The gods had given her that kindness to balance all the other hard things. Joffrey tipped his chin and said nothing at all. He looked around the hall with a disdain he could not quite keep trimmed. The northern lords looked back without heat. Gage came out with the loaf and Catelyn herself broke it, tore the heel and dipped it into salt, and offered it to each child in turn. Myrcella took the bread and tasted it as if it might dissolve into ash. Tommen ate too fast because fear had opened his stomach and made it foolish. Joffrey was the last and accepted it with his lip curled. When he had eaten, Catelyn nodded to Ser Rodrik. The old knight's whiskers caught the light. He spoke the words of guest right in a voice that had punished pages for untied straps and mattered now more than those pages ever had. It was done. Later, after the benches had filled and emptied and filled again, and the first shock of their arrival had settled into that thin, bright murmur that follows a thing too big for talk, Ned went to the solar with the weight of a king's death and a realm's unraveling in him and Catelyn beside him. Maester Luwin came up with them, and Theon behind, and Ser Rodrik and Galbart Glover, who had come down from Deepwood to be here for this night because he knew its shape, and Hallis Mullen with his hand on the pommel of his sword because that hand had been there since he was 14. "We've had riders from the south," Luwin said as soon as the door was closed. He had ink on his thumb and the look of a man who had not slept in 2 days. "The Riverlands burn. Lord Tywin broke Ser Edmure at the fords, and Ser Kevin ranges in force. They take no prisoners save to send a price to the crag or to Lannisport. Lord Hoster has taken to his bed and cannot be roused for counsel. And King's Landing?" Catelyn's voice thinned around the word king. It did not break on it. "Cersei holds the city with the gold cloaks and the gold," Luwin said. "Renly has fled to the Stormlands. Stannis is at Dragonstone and calls himself king of the 7 kingdoms by right of law." "By right of law," Theon said with a curl at the edge of his mouth that made it not quite mockery. "And the law is worth what sword it can hire." Ned stood with his hands on the high back of the chair that had been his father's and his father's father's. He felt the grooves where a long-ago fist had dug into the wood and stayed there through winter nights and summer councils. "Lord Stannis is Robert's heir," he said, the words simple and as heavy as any stone in the yard. "Not the boy downstairs, whatever is said to flatter or frighten." "Then why bring him north?" Galbart asked mildly. "I will not gainsay your law, my lord, but I will understand your game. Do I drink to Stannis before I sleep? Or to you? Or to my own sword?" for it seems soon as likely I must drink to it alone." "They're children," Catelyn said. "If there had been a gentler way." "There wasn't," Theon put in. "He had been a child when they made him a surety for peace." He wore the history as if it were a shirt he could not take off and found the seams chafed less if he swaggered. "Not with the Lannisters." Ned let the talk pass over him and under him for a moment until it settled. "I will not let the North be bled to make or unmake a king for the South," he said. "Not if there is a choice. We have guests under our roof, and they will be safe as any guests. They are also my surety that their mother will think twice before she burns Kingsroad and small folk alike. If any harm comes to them in my keeping, the gods will see me and curse me for it. If any harm comes to the North because I did not keep them, the gods will see that too. I am trying to thread between curses." He looked to Luwin. "Send ravens. To Stannis, that I will acknowledge his right if he holds his hand from my lands until I can bring mine to his cause as honor requires. To Cersei, that her children dine at my table and are under guest right, and that if she sends men to take them back in steel and fire, I will send them back wrapped in it." He felt Catelyn tense beside him and did not soften the words. "To Renly, that if he wants a king's chair, he may find one at my hearth while he remembers he is Lord of Storm's End. To Lord Tywin," he paused. The words seemed to taste wrong in his mouth. "Send him silence. He will read in it what he wants, or he will send another army to teach a lesson. He does not need our letters to decide to burn." "And the boy?" Ser Roderick asked carefully. "Joffrey." "He will be treated as a prince," Ned said, and the ruin of a thing that had never been whole made the words hurt. "I will not take from the child what the boy does not understand he never had. That justice belongs to the gods. Mine will be mercy enough to hold a kingdom together a little longer." Catelyn's hand found his sleeve and rested there a moment. "The gods be good to us," she said softly, and that was all. That night Ned went to the Godswood. The path was cinder-soft in places where the heat beneath warmed the earth even when the frost lay on the grass. The air in the wood had a taste like iron and sap together. The heart tree stood white and red, its face watching with those deep wells of eyes. The water in the pool lay black and kept the sky as a secret. He knelt. Words did not come. The gods did not ask for any. He let the silence do the speaking, and in it his thoughts lay down one by one like wolves returning to their places. Robert laughing with his mouth full of bones. Lyanna's hand cold at the end. The look on Sansa's face when Joffrey came into the hall. A boy's small weight on his palm when he helped Tommen down. The way Theon had flared and then looked to him and been steadied by the smallest sign. He put his forehead to the bark, and the bark was damp and living and older than any sin he could name. When he rose, he found he was not alone. Myrcella stood at the edge of the clearing with her hands tucked into her sleeves against the cold and her head cocked as if she were listening to a thing he could not hear. She started when she saw him see her and dipped again, and when she straightened there was color in her cheeks, a human warm thing that had nothing to do with the hot springs. "I did not mean to spy," she said. "This is no place for spies," he answered. "It is a place for truth. My uncle says there are no such places." She bit her lip, and the brief movement undid the poise of her face and showed the child below it. I don't know what I wanted." The tree looked sad. "It does," Ned said. "It sees a great deal." "Does it speak?" she asked. She asked like a girl who wanted stories from an old man's mouth but would hold still for the whole of them. "To those who know how to listen," he said. He did not tell her all he believed. No one had asked him to, and she was not for his gods whether she liked them or not. "Are you cold?" "Yes," she said candidly. "But it is good. It is like the water after a hot bath. It makes me clean." He did not laugh. "Your brothers are warm in their beds. There will be no warmth like the south here, but we have furs and fires enough." "My mother will send for us," Myrcella said, and made it almost a question. "She will," he said. "I think she will also send for my head. It would please her more." Myrcella looked away, and her mouth worked. She says many things when she is angry that she would not say if she were not." "Everyone does," Ned said, though not everyone had the chance to make kingdoms bleed with those things. In the morning, I will have a woman come to help you with your hair. If you go outside with it wet, it will freeze. She lifted a hand to it as if startled to discover it there. My Septa always says my hair is my crown. Your head is your crown, he said. The hair keeps it warm. She smiled despite herself. He would have carried that small lamp back to the hall with him if he could. Sleep, he said, and watched her go. Winterfell woke early, as it always had. The kitchens had the best heat and the best smells, and Tommen found his way there by following them as if they were a rope he could hold. Gage was a mountain in an apron with flour to his elbows and grease on his cheek, solemn as a priest. Tommen stood on the step that was worn thin by centuries of feet and peered up over a tray of scallions. A pair of kitchen girls looked past him at the door with their eyes wide, unsure if a prince were a thing to be handled like a spilled spice or a hot iron. Gage saved them from deciding. If you want a trencher, you say so, he told Tommen. If you want to stand and stare with your mouth open, I will hang you on the peg with the ladles. Tommen closed his mouth and opened it again. And then, because he was a child and the kitchen was warm, he tried a smile. A trencher, please. Gage nodded and set him to work by the ovens with a wooden spoon and a bowl of onions that had to be stirred in lard at a slow, steady pace. It is a rule of the kitchen, Gage told him, that if you eat, you help. If lords remembered it, there would be fewer hungry men. I'm not a lord, Tommen said. I'm a... He hesitated. For a moment his lip trembled. You are a boy, Gage said, saving him again. And boys with wooden spoons have to mind their wrists if they don't want blisters. He reached to set Tommen's hand right on the spoon. Tommen blinked furiously and nodded. Arya found them that way and leaned against the door with her arms folded. You'll cook your fingers, she told Tommen. You should be out in the yard. The dogs are hungry. Gage said I have to help or I can't eat, Tommen said. He looked stricken at his own boldness the moment the words left him. Arya grinned. Good, she told Gage. Make him work twice as hard. He looks like he's never mucked a stall in his life. I have not, Tommen confessed. We have boys had boys. I mean, you've hands, Arya said briskly. They'll do. She turned her head when summer patted in, as silent as the shadow of a hawk. The direwolf's head lifted and his nostrils flared. Tommen's spoon faltered. Arya watched the boy very carefully. Tommen swallowed. After a moment he set his spoon down and put his hand, small, chapped, with a knuckle he had bitten raw, out and forward. Summer came to it and sniffed, then pressed his head into the boy's palm with a weight that made Tommen laugh out loud in surprise. The sound warmed the room more than the ovens did. Gage looked over with a rare smile deepening the creases at his eyes. When Joffrey came the first time to the yard, he came with a brace of words held like knives and his shoulders set as if he walked into battle. His doublet had been made in the south and meant to flatter a prince in a warmer court. The wind found its seams and went through him. Robb stood with a sword of blunted steel in his hand and a grin he had learned from Theon and a steadiness he had learned from Ser Rodrik. His hair had gone darker in the cold. Grey wine stood behind him with ears pricked. Your Grace, Robb said, and made it sound neither mockery nor obeisance, only a statement of the thing the other boy believed of himself. Will you take a bout? I do not waste my time with pig farmers, Joffrey returned, but his eyes were already on the sword, the movement of it at Robb's hip. His hand flexed at his side because he was a boy yet, and boys were made to reach. You might waste mine, Robb said easily. Ser Rodrik says I am lazy as a cat in a patch of sun when no one is watching. You're a traitor's son, Joffrey said, loud enough for the men around the yard to hear. He wanted the heat of insult to warm him. He wanted it to make someone else bleed. You should be kneeling. The yard went still. Ser Rodrik cleared his throat. The yard is for steel, he said, not words. Robb did not look away from Joffrey. Even so, he said, do you kneel? Joffrey demanded. You call me your grace. Do you kneel? I kneel to the gods, Robb said. Sometimes in the snow. It chills one's knees. The old knight's whiskers jumped. Theon made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. Someone at the far end of the yard spat. Joffrey went red and reached as if to strike. Robb did not move. Grey Wind's lips peeled back over his teeth just enough to show white. His tail did not move. After a long moment, Joffrey dropped his hand. He turned away too fast and stumbled one step on the frost. Theon's mouth opened and then closed again. He did not grin this time. Later, when the anger had cooled enough to take shape, Ned took Joffrey down into the crypts. They went with torches and 2 guards. The air down there always had a grave's hush to it. The stones seemed to listen. The torches made long wet glints in the eyes of the kings along the walls. Iron blades lay across. Stony laps and remembered long, true winters. "Is this meant to frighten me?" Joffrey asked. He would not let his voice shake. He was his mother's son in that at least. "It is meant to teach you where words end," Ned said. "Your tongue has been sharpened on soft men who needed your favor. Here it will cut only you." They walked. He let the names come, Old Rhyme of the North, a cadence he had learned before he could read and had passed to his sons and would pass to his daughters if the world left him any daughters to pass to. Brandon of the Bloody Blade, Artos the Implacable, Edwyle, Ricard. He did not say Lyanna's name. There was no statue for her. Stone had spared them that. When they turned back, Joffrey's face was pale with the cold and the sight of all those iron swords. "The South has 7 gods," he said, defiant and thin. "And the North has none. That would be worse than a boy who thinks himself a god," Ned said. "We have old trees and old winters and old names. They last." "What will you do with us?" Joffrey asked abruptly. "Will you keep us here until we are old? Will you send men to cut off my mother's head? You think I don't know who you are? You betrayed the king." Ned stopped. His torch hissed and a drop of something hot fell from it on his hand, and he did not flinch. "I am a man who told the truth when it was asked of me," he said. "I am a father whose daughter was allowed to be dragged before a court and made to say that black was white to please a boy. I am a lord sworn to a king who died, and to a law that outlived him. You are a child. If you were any man's but the woman's who bore you, I would send you home with a guard and a letter and keep the swords for your grandfather. But the world is the world. I will not lie to you. I do not know what I shall do. I will keep you safe until I do." "Safe," Joffrey said. He made the word a sneer and a plea both because he did not know which would win him more. "You'd better keep me safe." Ned looked down at him and saw Robert standing there for the space of a breath. The jut of the jaw when he was angry, the way the eyes kindled when they wanted to be soothed and could not say so. He felt something old break and something older hold fast. "I have kept men safe who deserved it less," he said, "and some who deserved it more. Come." The first of the lords began to come in on the second day, drawn by the scent of something big in the wind and by messages sent on Ravenback. The Great John came swearing like a thunderstorm, laughing, slapping men on the back hard enough to make them stagger. Wyman Manderley sent his heir and a wagon load of smoked fish and a letter that said there were ships if ships were needed. Roose Bolton came quiet, smooth as oiled leather, with men whose eyes slid sideways as if they did not want to catch on anything, and a standard rolled tight so its flayed man wouldn't startle the children in the yard. They salaamed to Catelyn and bowed to Ned and measured the lion cubs with eyes that did accounts of cost and gain without moving their mouths. The Great John brought beer that tasted of pine and bragged that he would drink Joffrey under the table. When the boy refused, the Umber laughed, and his laughter had a sound like gravel under a wheel. "He'll do well in the cold," he boomed to Ned. "Ice will keep him." He was half a jest away from saying a thing that could not be unsaid when he caught Catelyn's eye and swallowed it. Roose suggested softly that the children might be sent to the Dreadfort because its walls were stout and its rooms warm with the steam that ran under them. "My men are pliant to your command," he said. "The realm will be soothed to know the young lions are housed in such security. It will be a lesson to their grandfather that the North is not moved by threats." "The North remembers other things too," Catelyn said before Ned could. "It remembers the duty of a host." Roose bowed as if she had praised him. His eyes were a shade of pale a hawk might have if a hawk's eyes could be made of water that had known ice. They ate without feathers and gold on their plates because Winterfell was not that kind of hall, and the talk spread like butter that had to be scraped thin to cover so much bread. Men leaned close to say words they wanted the Lord to hear. Women watched the faces of their husbands and guessed where their thoughts went when their mouths smiled. Myrcella sat straight and did not commit her gaze. Tommen fell asleep over a trencher and woke with gravy on his lip and sat up mortified until Arya put a napkin over her own nose and crossed her eyes at him to make him laugh. Sansa had her embroidery out because she was the kind of girl who remembered her needles even in disaster, and the constant practice steadied her hands when nothing else did. Myrcella watched the tiny disciplined movements and asked for a hoop. When they sat together with the light on their faces, one copper pail, one barley gold. Catelyn came and stood in the doorway a long time because the sight was so strange and so normal it made her feel two things at once that could not be felt together. "Sansa," Myrcella said carefully without lifting her eyes from the needle. "Does it snow so much here every year?" "More," Sansa said. Her voice was only a little brittle. "There will be days you cannot see the towers at the other end of the yard." "What do you do?" "Make cakes with honey when there is honey, and take baths in the pools when there is no work to be done." Sansa's stitches kept their evenness by force. "And sometimes you sing." She paused very slightly. "In the south we learned court songs. They sound thin in the stone here. There are better ones for winter." "I would like to hear them," Myrcella said. She did not say I learned some too. She had learned to keep some things back because they were too sharp to touch. "If you like." Sansa breathed and nodded, and for a moment, in the tight circle of that breath, she seemed the person she would have been if she had not gone south. "If I like," she said, and there was humor in it. "I might not." They bent their heads together over the hoops, and the shine of the needle flashed like a tiny cold star. Bran watched from the window seat while Hodder stood behind him like a tree. He measured the yard with his eyes and counted the guards and knew where the weak spot would be if there had been one. Summer lay across his feet, heavy and real, and out beyond the wall the wind moved over the hills like a hand smoothing a blanket. He looked at Joffrey when the boy came into the yard again, and at the way Grey Wind stood up slow as a glacier lifting. He watched Theon throw an apple to Tommen and tell him he'd better not drop it because Theon would take it back if he did, and Tommen catch it and grin. Osha came to the bench and squatted without asking. She had a way of balancing on her heels that made Bran think of cats. "Your Lord Father has dragged Winter to his house," she said, "and Summer doesn't like guests." "Summer likes who I like," Bran said, and put his hand down on the wolf's back and felt the long threads of muscle move under his palm. "Do you like them?" Osha asked. She had the smell of the yard on her and a wild tang the rest did not. "The ones with sunshine in their hair." Bran thought about it. He knew better now than to say yes or no when he did not know. "They are here," he said finally. "That's enough to like or not like another day." Osha's teeth showed in a grin. "You've more of your duh in you than that sweet face says," she told him. "Don't fall asleep when the snow talks." "I won't," Bran said. He was not entirely certain he knew what she meant, but he knew enough to watch the snow. It made its own songs. As the days turned, the strangers made their patterns on Winterfell's surface and fit into grooves that seemed to have been waiting for them. Tommen learned to hold the dogs by the scruff and not be dragged. Myrcella learned to wrap wool tight around her head and not cry when the wind found the skin inside her ears. She learned to eat onion and turnip and ask for them again. She learned where the stones were slickest around the pools and which baths steamed hottest and how to step across ice and hear it sing but not crack. Joffrey learned very little at all. He learned that when he shouted in the yard, the sound went nowhere because the walls did not bring back echoes for boys who had not earned them. He learned the taste of northern beer and spat it out. He learned that Ser Roderick's eyes were as sharp as any steel when a lad thought to carry a knife where knives were not to be. He learned that Grey Wind could pick up the hem of his cloak with his teeth and hold him fast there without tearing a thread until Robb came and took it back with a word. He learned, in short, that Winterfell did not bend to him. It only received him as it did snow and storm and men who came in out of them. Ned wrote letters and sharpened quills and listened to men who said they loved him and men who had reasons to love the things he could give more. He watched Caitlin step through her household as if it were a field where some of the stones might explode. He slept little and, when he did sleep, dreamed that he had never left and that none of this had been necessary. In those dreams, the godswood was full of green and laughter, and the heart tree stood very young with a face he did not know yet. He woke always to the sound of water moving through stone. On the 7th morning, the first true breath of snow came, not the flurry and melt that had teased the yard these last days, but a slow, steady fall that softened the pitch of the rooftops and blurred the edges of banners and made the world near. The sound of the yard changed under it. Boots scuffed quieter. Horses shook themselves as if they bore an extra weight. The men cursed softer because the white made them remember their mothers. Ned went to the wall walk and looked south. The air had a visibility like milk. Anything could have been beyond that field of white. The south might have been warm and golden and full of oranges, or it might have been already burning. It made no difference to the cold at his throat under the scarf. Hallis Malin came to stand with him a while without speaking. "See there," Hallis said finally and pointed. A raven came out of the whiteness and made for the rookery, beating its wings as if it had flown through heavy water. Ned watched it go as a man might watch his own doom come walking up the hall. He went down the inner steps to the maester and found Luwin already untying the tiny cylinder from the bird's leg with careful fingers. "It seems the air remembers all the old songs," Luwin said, as if the raven had told him a joke in the tongues of the first men. His eyes were brighter than they had any right to be. "From Castle Black," he added, and did not need to. Ned knew the look of black wax. He broke the seal and read and felt the world tilt as if a wave had lifted it out from under him and put it back not quite where it had been. He handed it to Luwin because he trusted the man to read it and not break, and he stood with his hand on the window stone and felt it damp and old against his palm. "What news?" Caitlin asked in the voice that had begun to follow him into rooms ahead of her. "Snow," he said softly. "On both sides." He put the letters away and let the world make its slow turn. "We do what we can where we stand." He went to find his children then, and the children who were not his, because the snow had begun and the things a man did at the beginning of snow mattered. He found Tommen with Summer in the yard and Myrcella with Sansa on the bench by the window and Joffrey in the corridor outside the armory with his jaw set tight because the blade he wanted to wear was not meant for him yet, and he had been told so. He put his hand on the door he had held since boyhood and felt the grain and the groove and the little notch he had made once with a careless sword tip that had gotten away from him when Brandon had laughed. He opened it and went into the space that held his father's breath in winter and his mother's voice in summer and the ghosts of all of it, and he began again to be Lord of Winterfell, which was the only thing he knew how to be without teaching. The snow fell and would keep falling. Winter had begun. That night there was a meal of onions and mutton with a glaze of something sweet that Gage had hoarded without telling anyone, and after it old Nan took her chair by the hearth as if she had been set in it by the gods and began. Not a story of blue-eyed dead things that walked out on crackle nights. Not yet, but one of wolves that had learned to sing words. Myrcella sat between Arya and Sansa with her hands folded and let the sounds wash over her as if they might teach her the grammar of the stones. Tommen's head drooped and lifted, until Summer snorted him fully awake and he giggled and hid his face in the direwolf's ruff. When Joffrey spoke, his voice was lower than it had been. "We have singers in the south," he said to no one in particular. "So do we," Arya said without looking at him, and the line was not the barb it could have been. "Our singers tell you when to come in from the fields." "We don't have fields," Joffrey said. "You don't," Arya agreed and let it pass. Ned watched them and thought, not for the first time, of Torrhen Stark kneeling to Aegon the Conqueror to keep fire off his people, and of all the men who had called that wisdom cowardice and then eaten the bread that had come of it. He thought of the child beside the hearth with the gold hair lit like halo and the other child who might have been a good king if kings were made by kindness, and of the third who was a boy with acid in him and the old woman whose stories had long ago taught his own children when to run and when to dig in their heels. He tried to see a line forward through the snow and could not. He saw only the next step. Keep bread on the table, keep swords sharp, keep the children warm. Later he went to the yard again because the habit of it had worn a path in him. He found Theon there throwing a ball up into the snow and trying to catch it behind his back like a fool. He missed half the time and swore in a language that still carried salt in it when it was spoken. He straightened when he saw Ned and gave the loose, rakish bow that said he had remembered something he had meant to forget and would not let anyone see it. "You don't like the look of this," Ned said. "I like the look of a ship," Theon said, and jerked his chin toward where the south was. "But the sea doesn't run to Winterfell." He hesitated, teeth on the inside of his lip. "That boy will cause trouble," he said bluntly. "The mean one. They always do. They can't help it." "He is a boy," Ned said. "So am I," Theon said and laughed once in a hard bark. "Ask the men whose wives I've kissed if they think it makes me harmless." Ned looked at him. "I am asking you to be more than you want to be," he said. "You always are," Theon said and tossed the ball. It vanished into the falling white and came back down and hit him neatly in the palm. He closed his fingers around it and grinned, reckless again. "It's why I stay." The snow did not stop. It remade the yard hour by hour. It softened Joffrey's footsteps and muffled his one shouted order to a groom that went nowhere. It stuck in Myrcella's lashes until she looked as if she wore a fragile crown. She blinked it away and laughed. It made Tommen an artist with sticks, drawing maps only he could read on the white and marching the dogs through them. It clung to Grey Wind's back and made him a moving drift. It settled on the high tower and the broken one and the maester's rookery and the hall and the heart tree and the small rise that Catelyn always climbed when she needed to be alone with her thoughts and the gods of her wedding and the gods of her girlhood both, and on the armory door where a boy had marked it once, and on the old stones that drank heat and gave it back. When the raven came from the south again, it wore a thread of red silk on its leg, the kind they used at court when they wanted half the message to be the color and not the words. Ned read and did not smile. He went to the great hall and found the children with their porridge and said nothing about the letter while they ate because there was a law that a man must keep in his house if he wanted his house to keep him. No news over porridge, good or ill. He waited until the bowls had been licked clean and set aside and then said to Joffrey, "Your mother writes. She says the city is yours." "Of course it is," Joffrey said, quick. "It always was." Ned held his gaze. "I think," he said, "you may find that when men say yours, they mean theirs in your name." He let that sit. "She says she wants her children home." Joffrey went stiff as a boy about to buck. Myrcella's spoon clicked against the rim of her bowl. Tommen looked from one face to another and did not know what to read and so read nothing. "She will have them," Ned said, "when the way is clear, when there is law to guide us rather than knives. That means not yet." Joffrey stood too fast and knocked his bench sideways. The sound went hard across the hall and made heads lift. "I am the law," he said, but the words were thin as paper the instant they left him, and he seemed to hear it. He put his bench back without being told and sat down and stared at the table. "Not here," Ned said, but he did not press it. The heart tree would not need him to put every wrong thought right the instant it arose. Snow worked slower. He wrote again. He sent again. He ate, he walked. He listened to old Nan tell of men who promised iron and delivered tin, and to Osha mutter about things that moved in the woods that were not animals. He watched his sons and daughters in the yard, and the not his who had come to be his problem, and he put his hands around their small lives as gently as a man might cup a candle flame in a gale. The wind did what it would. He did what he must, and the white kept falling, and the steam rose from the baths and made ghosts in the night, and the old stones drank warmth and gave it back, as they had, as they would, as they must, until the time came when the warmth would not be enough and men would have to find another kind. In the gods would. The face in the heart tree was full of secrets and did not look away. Ned went there each day now because the habit of it was the only arithmetic that made sense. He did not always kneel. Sometimes he only walked the perimeter, counting the breaths between his steps, the crows' voices, the drops from a leaf to the surface of the pool. 6, 6, 5, the stutter where one drop caught on a snag of bark and waited and then fell in company with the next. He thought of Stannis and his narrow mouth and his absolute words. He thought of Renly and the way men wanted to love him. He thought of the men whose names he did not know who would die either way. He did not look for answers on the bark. The old gods were not augurs. They were stone and sap and the watching that came of both. Myrcella came sometimes now without starting when she saw him. She walked the edge of the pool without slipping and had the northern trick of not making her mouth into a bow when the cold found it. "The water never freezes," she told him once, in a voice of wonder, after she had knelt and put her hand into it to prove it was not a trick. "It should. It does not know how," Ned said. "The springs teach it to be warm." "The south has only one kind of warm," she said. "I did not know there were more."
Nedel
Okayed at her and saw a girl who would make a better queen than any of the men who called themselves king would make a king. He hoped she would live long enough to be a good wife to some lord and break no one's heart but her own. He did not hope for more because he had learned, finally and too late, not to hope too much. The knights were talking knights. The fire's voice in the hall told the same story over and over with different wood to give it variety. Men rolled dice, and whether the gods cared what pattern the bones showed, no one could say. Ser Roderick drilled boys by torchlight because the cold made their arms go lazy if he did not, and laziness made cowards, and cowards made widows. Sansa sang low to songs that fit the stone. Joffrey did not sing. He stared into the fire with his jaw clenched, as if he could teach it to burn what he wanted it to burn by looking at it long enough. When the letter came that bore Stannis' hand, Luwin took it from a bird that had lost feathers to ice somewhere over the winter hills. "He is not a man for words," Luwin said as he carried it to Ned. "And yet he seems to have found some." Ned read. The lines were hard and the ink dried thick where the pen had been pressed too long. There was in it a promise of justice so clean it would cut bone, and a demand so reasonable any man would bleed to meet it. Ned folded it, unfolded it, folded it again, the way a man might handle the blade of a new knife to learn its balance. "Will you go?" Catelyn asked when he had told her the gist of it. He had not given her the letter. He did not ever give her Stannis' letters. That was a cruelty he spared her. "I will send men," he said. "I will send my word. I will keep the lever I have until the fulcrum is set. If I give it up before, we move only the weight and not the world." She nodded. "And the children?" Her voice did not waver on the word. He looked past her out the window at the yard where Tommen and two of the kennel girls were trying to teach Shaggy Dog to drag a sledge by bribing him with strips of bacon. At the bench where Sansa had set her hoop aside to rub the ache from her fingers. At the place by the hearth where Joffrey stood with his fists clenched at his sides and his chin lifted as if there were a crown he could hold on with posture alone. At the Godswood where he knew Myrcella would be sooner or later with her hand. In the water. "They stay," he said. "They stay until the road south is a road and not a killing ground, and the laws we say we live by stand on their feet again." Catelyn stood very still. "Then winter will be long," she said. "It will," he said. "Then we had best lay in wood," she answered, and left him because that was her work. And he watched her go with the love and fear and gratitude that had braided into the rope by which he climbed through these days and did not fall. When sleep came, it came with a different dream. He stood again in the crypts, but the statues had turned their heads to look at him, and their eyes were not blind stone. They were the eyes of his children, and of other children who were not his and were still his problem, and of boys he had been and men he had known and men he had killed or had not killed and should have, and girls he had loved and had failed. Each had an iron sword across its lap, and each sword was warm with the heat of a spring that ran beneath the world. "Do the thing before you," the eyes said. And it was so simple it almost made him laugh, and so hard it made him wake with tears and not know whose they were. The snow kept falling. The world narrowed to walls and smoke and the sound of wood splitting under an axe. Winterfell became itself again, the stronghold and the hearth. Men took up tasks because the tasks were there and because taking them up kept fear at the far end of the table. Word came from White Harbor that the sea had not frozen and ships still moved if one paid enough. Slow as cows in slush but moving, and that the Merman's Court would feed any black-cloaked man who came to its gate because some shames could be eaten only with bread. Word came from the Riverlands that men put chaff into their beds to keep warm, and that a village that had been sacked took down its sept and burned the timbers in it because the gods would forgive fire when men could not. In all of it, There were 3 children with yellow hair who learned the weight of fur and the taste of onion, and there were other children who had known both all their lives and learned the taste of the South Stout and the weight of other people's futures. They moved around one another like planets learning their gravity. The pull was not always pleasant. It held. One morning Ned found Joffrey in the small yard behind the armory with a wooden practice blade that someone had given him when they should not have. He hacked at a post with so much anger and so little craft that the blade ricocheted and smacked his knee. He hissed and swore and struck again. The post did not mind. It had been standing there since men who remembered his great-grandfather's name were boys. "Do you want to learn?" Ned asked. "Or do you want it to look as if you did?" Joffrey glared. There was sweat on his lip despite the cold. He wanted to say there was nothing a northern trader could teach him. He wanted to say it so badly his mouth moved and no words came. "You can learn here," Ned said mildly. "The wood does not flatter." Joffrey threw the sword at the snow and folded his arms. "You'll kill me," he said. He said it flat. "When it suits you. Or you'll send me to some lord to be pricked with needles until I bleed so that people say you are kind." "Why should I learn anything from you?" "Because you will be a man," Ned said, "if you live. And men who don't learn become the tools of men who did." Joffrey stared at him. It was a long stare and an honest one, and it made the boy inside show for a moment through the arrogance. He bent and picked up the wooden blade and held it properly without knowing he was doing it. "Show me," he said finally, as if it were a punishment he was offering himself to, and Ned took up another stick and did. The yard filled with the sound of wood on wood. It drew men in ones and twos, as such sounds always did. Their hands found the habits they could trust. Robb came and did not interfere. Ser Rodrik watched and did not. Theon swaggered and jeered and then shut his mouth when the look Ned gave him was not anger, only weariness, and he could not bear to add anything to it. Sansa stood in the doorway with her hoop forgotten and looked as if something unexpected had bloomed in a pot she had thought dead. Arya nodded once, a small and fierce movement, as if she approved of a thing that would make future mischief more interesting. When they were done and Joffrey's hair was pasted to his head and he was breathing in sharp pulls, Ned put his stick away and said nothing at all, because praise should be scarce as pearls when the work had only begun. That afternoon, under a sky that was the color of old tin, a man came in from the south with a torn cloak and a story that did not have to be spoken to be known. He had the look of a stag that had run too far and laid down because it had forgotten how to stand up. He fell on his knees at the gate and asked for bread, and the gate gave it to him because that was what gates in the north did. He ate, and once he had some part of himself back in him, he said that men in red were giving out fire like favors and calling it God, and that boys laughed when steel rang because it meant their bellies would be full. He might have been lying. He might have been a fever story. It did not change the wood that needed splitting or the children who needed boots or the wolves who needed meat. Ned went to the God's Wood with that too and laid it down among the others. Snow fell into the pool and did not melt until it reached the place where the hot water took it in. He watched it go. He did not ask for more than the next step. In the deep of night, when the hall had only the sound of sleeping men in it and the steam from the baths moved in the courtyards like breath, he woke and could not tell if it was because a raven had called or because some part of him was a raven now and called to himself. He walked through the hush and listened to Winterfell breathe. He stood in the corridor outside the chambers where the children slept and heard nothing from inside that was not sleep. He moved on. He stood under a window and watched the snow with the peace and grief a man feels when he sees again the river he swam in as a boy and knows it has been waiting for him in this shape all along. The world beyond his walls would do what the world does. It would make kings and unmake them. It would burn and be put out and burn again. Some men would grow fat. Some would grow wise. Some would grow dead. He could only hold this place against it a little while and teach the boys and the girls, and the ones who were and the ones who were not his, the tastes of onion and law, of iron and courtesy, of bread and salt. The snow went on falling. The old stones drank the warmth and gave it back. The hot water sang underfoot. In the God's Wood, the white tree watched without blinking, and the face carved into it held its secret. And in the rooms of children, a prince dreamed of swords, a boy of dogs and meat, and a girl of a pool that could not freeze, and Sansa of a song that fit the stone, and Arya of tracks in fresh snow that would be gone by morning, and Bran of a sky without walls, and Ned of nothing at all for once, which was a mercy the gods sometimes gave to men who came to them late with full hands. In the first blue of morning the snow was clean as parchment, unmarred yet by the day's scrawl of feet and hooves and sled runners, and the sky seemed near enough to lean a shoulder on. The ravens muttered to themselves in the rookery, feathers fluffed, a soft fidgeting sound like men shifting on a bench. Ned rose before the heat had woken in the stones and walked the yard once with Hallis Malin at his side, saying nothing, listening to Winterfell's old pulse find its slow, winter rhythm again. Smoke from the distant charcoalers took the hue of slate. The kennel yard breathed warm, rank animal breath. Far in the gods wood a single crow called and waited for an answer no one with a man's throat could give. Rickon toddled into the day with his boots on the wrong feet and his hair the color of bare earth in spring. He did not so much walk as bounce, knees lifting high like a pony in deep drifts. Shaggy Dog shot past him, black as a hole in the snow, a streak with teeth and a tongue and a joy that bit. Osha padded after, long-legged and loose-jointed, wearing a cloak she had torn into a shape that suited her and no other living thing. "Little lord," she said as she caught Rickon by the back of his jerkin when he lunged after the wolf as if he were a spear he meant to throw. "Slow or you'll break your nose and then cry about it." "I don't cry," Rickon protested, outraged and earnest together. "You don't," Osha agreed, as one reciting a creed. "But your nose does. It will run like a brook and ruin Gage's stew." Rickon giggled. Shaggy Dog wheeled, came back, and slammed into his knees. They went down together in a scramble of wool and small elbows, the wolf's jaws snapping at snowflakes as if each were an insult he would answer personally. Where he went, the day felt less safe to other people and more alive to Rickon. When Joffrey came round the corner of the yard just then, wrapped in fur he had decided was beneath him and wearing a scowl to cover the sting in his cheeks, he stopped and stared as the black wolf barreled toward him in a way no dog in the south would dare. Shaggy Dog didn't slow. He reefed up short at the last moment with a spray of powder and a low, grumbling growl that was not threat so much as a statement. "I am mine." Joffrey took a step back, which was only wisdom, then caught himself and stepped forward again because he had a stock of pride that would keep him warm if he were careful and foolish if he was not. His hand lifted fast as if to cuff, then hesitated, fingers curling. Shaggy Dog's lips peeled back in a delighted, ugly grin. "Don't," Arya said from the wall walk above them. Her voice carried neat as a rope thrown. She had learned where to place it so it would hold. She swung down the rungs, boots landing light. "He'll take your fingers off and keep them as a game." Joffrey flushed a blotchy, unhappy red. "He's a dog." "He's a wolf," Arya corrected without heat. "He doesn't know what a prince is either." Rickon scrambled up with Osha's help and planted himself between Joffrey and the wolf with the hot fierceness of a small master. "Mine," he said, and Shaggy Dog bumped his hip as if to say, "That's right." Tommen arrived at a panting trot moments later, mittens dangling by their cords from his sleeves. "If you run, it warms you," he told Joffrey with the air of someone confiding a secret. "If you stand still, it hurts your nose." Myrcella, coming slower with Sansa, smiled with her eyes when she saw her brothers. "Everything hurts your nose," she said gently. "We have learned this." "Not the bath," Tommen said. "That hurts your skin." "Only at first," Sansa said, and the corner of her mouth lifted. It had begun to find the habit of lifting again. She had wrapped Myrcella well, the wool bound neat and clever over the ears the way northern women did without seeming to think about the act. She had learned the feel of someone else's fine hair through cloth and did not flinch when her fingers met it. Myrcella stood straight because that was what a princess did in any weather. Her cheeks were raw with the cold and more alive for it. Joffrey had not answered Arya's not quite warning. He looked down at the wolf and up at Arya and then, with an effort that made his jaw jump, looked past them both. "Where is your father?" He asked no one and everyone, as if the answer owed him itself. "In the yard," Arya said. "Or the gods would, or the roofs, or the hall." He is Lord of Winterfell. He's everywhere." "Like fleas," Theon drawled, swinging round a buttress with his own wolfish ease, his grin like flint. "The place is full of them. Be polite and they won't bite you where it hurts." Joffrey's eyes went narrow. Theon only laughed, not cruel but not kind either. That was his way. In the great hall, the smell of porridge and onion warmed the dim to something almost rich. Ned ate with the lords who had come and the men who had ridden with them, at a table lower than the high one because winter was a flattening thing and good policy was another. He spoke little. He held his questions like tools he meant to use at the right time, not toys to be fidgeted with. The great John boomed of snows he had seen that had buried barns in a night and women he had known who would have melted them if let near. Roose ate sparingly, with a fastidiousness that belonged more to a maester than a lord who had flayed. His voice, when he used it, came quiet enough that men leaned in to catch it and discovered they were listening closer than they had meant to. "You have pulled at a lion's beard, Lord Stark," Roose said mildly, "and have the tuft in your fist. If you hold, he claws. If you let go, he bites. The only winning play may be to shave the beast." The great John snorted. "I'll shave him," he said, "from the jaw down to the belly, and the bits in between I'll keep in a jar, to show boys what happens when you piss on the wolf's den." "Peace," Ned said, not because he thought the great John would do it, but because words had a habit of making their own future if no one kept them tied to the table. He turned his head and the room stilled in degrees. "I asked you here to lay wood, not to strike sparks." He lifted a hand. "I will not have a war in this hall between men who will need to stand shoulder to shoulder before the year is out." "Against whom?" Galbart Glover asked. He had a steady look and hands like shovels. "The Lannisters? The Ironborn? The dead?" He said the last without drama. Osha had that effect on the people who heard her in the yard. "Against winter," Ned said simply. "The rest will come as it comes." When they had eaten and the benches scraped back and the first errands of the day began to knot themselves around men's ankles, Maester Luwin came with a bundle of letters tied neat as a priest's sash. His cheeks were chapped and his eyes bright with the glee of an old man who has something that will matter to someone else. "Castle Black," he said, tapping the topmost with one blunt finger. "The hand is not one I know, my lord, but the seal is black." Ned broke it and saw John's square script before the words made sense. He read slowly at first as if the letters were a wound that might reopen at a touch, then faster as the cadence of the boy's hand caught him and pulled him along. He gave no sign as he read. Catelyn knew him, and so read the set of his mouth, the hitch in his breath when a line struck true. When he finished, he folded the letter and smoothed the fold with 2 fingers, then held it for her. She read, and it was only paper and ink and the journey of a raven through snow and wind and over long distances of cold air. But she saw, distinct as the line of a hill against dawn, a boy standing on a wall that held back a weather bigger than men, and behind him other boys and other men in black who laughed and were afraid and did both in the same hour and learned not to be ashamed for it. She saw the word uncle and the word gone and the word cold written without adornment. She saw John tell them that he was learning to live with the shape of the world and that the shape had edges. She saw no complaint in it and some hope and a place where hope stopped and left off abruptly as if it had come to a cliff and could not fly. "Read it to the children," Ned said softly. He did not say, "Read it to Joffrey." He did not need to. She would do that work because she trusted words to smooth what sharpness could be smoothed and to instruct where instruction could happen. In the solar, after the noon meal, he wrote back himself before the sun had climbed an inch past the sill. His writing had a soldier's economy and a father's inability to say the thing he wanted to say plainly, so he said everything around it instead. The snow, the wolves, the way the old stones still kept a man's feet honest. He told John that he was proud of him as a man might say there is dry wood stacked under the eaves, which was not a thing that needed saying unless someone had worried there wasn't. He did not tell John about the gold-haired children in his hall because that would be to throw their small bodies into a different kind of wind. He only told him that men were coming and going with news that had more teeth than body to it, and he meant to blunt what he could. At noon they gathered in the solar with the door snug shut against the wind's curiosity. The light there was kinder than the halls, and the air smelled of beeswax and parchment and the faint iron tang from the ink pot. Sansa sat very straight and smoothed her skirt the way her mother had taught her when she was younger and fidgeted without knowing it. Arya sprawled in the careless twist she could be called from and be standing with a sword in her hand by the time a man took a breath. Bran leaned in the chair Luwin had contrived for him and let the wool pad under him give what the old stone would not. Rickon had been bribed to stillness with a sweet that would make his teeth ache later, and he gnawed it with fierce attention. Myrcella folded her hands in her lap and watched Catelyn with that composed interest she wore when she knew the hour's outline and meant to make a good shape inside it. Tommen sat forward, eyes bright, because a letter meant news and news might be an adventure, and adventures for boys in Winterfell had wolves in them. Joffrey lounged against the window embrasure as if his bones were bored. He could not quite keep his mouth disdainful. The cold pinched it away. He watched Catelyn as if she were a servant performing for him. It would have been easier to hate him if he had not, once or twice, in the last days, blinked his eyes too fast when the cold bit and looked away from the fire as if he had swallowed too much heat at once and could not show it. Catelyn read. She did not make more of Jon's words than they were, and she did not make less. She did not soften, because there was nothing in the letter that wanted softening. Jon wrote of drills in the yard with a sword too heavy for boys who hadn't been fed enough in their childhoods. Of the way wind could find the one stitch in a glove that had been badly done. Of the laughter of men who were learning to find it again. He wrote of old Bear Mormont as a mountain with a voice and of Maester Aemon as an old man whose eyes saw more for being clouded. He wrote that he had dreamed he was a boy who was a bird and woke with a feather on his pillow and laughed at himself, and then said he had not been laughing when he went along the top of the wall in lantern light and the ice glittered like teeth. He did not say the word other. He wrote instead of men vanishing and a pinching cold that did not come from wind alone and of a quiet that set a man listening to his own breath and wondering if the night listened back. He signed himself, "Your bastard who is trying to be a man." He did not write love, and Catelyn was grateful and guilty that he had not and that she had wanted it so. Tommen asked, "Can we go there?" As if the wall were only a castle further north that one might ride to for a feast and be home by the next thaw. "No," Arya said promptly. "It is too far. And too cold," Sansa added, softening Arya's practical blow with one of her own. "There are not even songs enough for it." "There are," Myrcella said unexpectedly, and then flushed at her own boldness. "There are 3 that the fingers remember even if the tongue forgets the words." The Septa said they were old. "Old songs are best in old stone," Oldnan said from the door, because there were no shut doors where she did not think her stories had a right to go. "Walls keep them. Men let them blow away." Ned left them with their letter and went to the yard again because the habit of walking the same ground when his mind was full had taught him more of lordship than any maester's tract. He found Ser Rodrik drilling boys on the hard-packed ground where the snow had been mashed flat by 100 feet. The old knight's whiskers were stiff with frost. He barked and boys moved, a predictable alchemy. Robb traded blows with Jory's cousin, Clay, both laughing through their breathing. Theon spun a staff in a way that made it look a toy. Grey Wind watched him with interest, as if the staff were a rabbit he might lunge for and so surprise them all. Joffrey came to the edge and paused. The raw wanting in his face when steel met wood and rang clean was a thing he could not quite disguise. He had learned in the last days to look to Ned before he did a thing. A habit begun in self-preservation and edging toward respect like ice forming along a stream. Ned inclined his head, and Joffrey stepped out between 2 boys 6 months younger than he and took his place without speaking, without any of the graceless swagger that had marked him when he first had a stick in his hand. Ser Rodrik nodded once, which was lavish for him, and Ned filed the look away. Small currents made rivers in time. In the kitchen's Gage taught Tommen the art of not burning onions and the deeper craft of holding a spoon so his wrist would still be useful when he was 30. The boy had a gift for earnestness that found willing tutors in all the rooms where apprentices were welcome and heirs scorned. He learned to tie knots that would release with a tug when a dog pulled and to scrub a comb without snapping its teeth as he went. It was possible to imagine him as a man with a house where laughter lived, to imagine him with boys of his own who were not princes and so did not have to be killed for or by anyone. Ned broke himself of that imagining with the same care he used when he set aside an unsteady thought about Sansa singing for a southern court. The world was the world. Imaginings were for evenings when men were too tired to go on and needed a spark to make the next step. Sansa, in those same kitchens in the afternoons when the light was good and the warmth best, took Myrcella through stitches no one had thought to teach her because in King's Landing a princess's hands were for receiving favors, not making them. Myrcella listened, not humbly exactly, but with a steadiness that came very near honesty. When she pricked her finger she sucked it hard and looked as if she might cry and then did not. She learned to make a small, neat knot that was invisible on the underside of a piece, and she learned to cut thread with a knife by feel instead of teeth, and she learned to anchor a leaf so it would sit without puckering on winter wool. Sansa did not once say, "I was to be your queen." Myrcella did not once say, "I was to be queen somewhere else." They did not say their mothers' names. They said turnip and broth and green and winter and needle and yes and no and again. That was enough. On the 5th day of the new snow, Luwin brought a different letter, the wax pale as bone and the hand as straight as a sword. Stannis. Ned read it in his solar with the world narrowed to his breath and the scratch of the maester's sleeve when he shifted. The words were as Ned had expected: claim, law, duty, treason. But there was in them a restrained fire like a banked coal that would not go out in a gale. At the bottom, the signature looked hammered rather than written. He brings me a clean blade, Ned thought, and asks me to cut the world with it. He invites you to Dragonstone, Luwin said, as if the island were a day's swift ride from the hot pools. He says a council of men who remember the law could end this with quills instead of spears. He says he will have his hand reach White Harbor to be guided north if north is where wisdom still lives. The law is not a piece of hide to be cut into any shape that suits its owner, Ned said. It is a table. Men sit at it or they don't. Luwin looked pleased in the baffled way of a man who has heard a turn of phrase he likes and knows he will get to repeat. Shall I write that back? Write that I will hear any man who comes with clean hands and leaves his fires behind. The White Harbor Road was still a road then, not yet a series of guesses and holes, and when the Onion ship made the long tack into the mouth of the White Knife with its cargo of hard bread and hard truths, Wyman Manderly's men saw it and sent a boy with a bell and a sled to the new castle. The bell sent other bells ringing. By dusk Sir Wylis had given orders for rooms to be warmed for a man who preferred simple food and a clean bed, and the kitchen had found onions as if by miracle and set them to stew with bone. The envoy from Dragonstone slept one night under the merman's carved vault, and in the morning he set out with 3 Manderly men and a sledge built for speed. He could have taken ship round the Bight and tried for Barrowton or the Cape, but winter is a northern animal that does not care for southern plans. The river and the road together would be safer if anything was. He arrived with his nose half-bitten and his hands raw, carrying his glove like a man who had sized it wrong and endured it. He had a banner with a flaming heart that he did not raise in the yard because Stannis Baratheon had not seen any use in metal for this purpose yet, and because a stranger's flag at Winterfell's heart would have been an insult. He gave his name in the great hall without flourish. Davos, my lord, knight, but not of the ancient sort. His coat was salt-stained and carefully mended. His hands were those of a man who had not learned the trick of being idle. He bowed awkwardly, then properly when he remembered, and looked at people in the eye without flinching. Wyman Manderly's men spoke well of him because he had refused a bed any warmer than the one they had taken, because he had thanked the cook by name, because he had known, somehow, the right price for 3 onions in a port where prices moved like fish, and then smiled as if he did not mind the movement. The Great John liked him on sight for his scars. Roose Bolton liked him not at all for his scars. Catelyn watched his face because men carried their past there when they were too tired to carry it anywhere quieter. Your lord, Davos said mildly when he had been fed and warmed and given a cup of ale that he inspected as if it were a tide to be read, has right on his side as sharp as any blade I've handled. He glanced to Ned not as if begging favor but as if checking a mark on a chart. He asks not for love but for law. He says that is enough. It will be, Ned said, if men remember what the word means. Davos smiled a small, private smile that for a moment made him look like a younger man who had pulled a trick and gotten away with it and then laughed because it had been simple. "The sea remembers," he said. "Men forget and then learn again. The sea teaches the same lesson as long as the shoreline holds. You cannot bargain with what is bigger than you." Ned did not ask if he meant winter or kingship or gods. He knew the answer could be any and all. They spoke in the solar with the door shut and Luwin at the small table with a sand shaker and Caitlin by the window with her work in her lap and her eyes on their faces. The lords had been here too long to be kept out of any room where words that mattered might be said. But Ned had learned which talk would run away if it smelled too many men in the same space. The great John took himself to the yard to see if he couldn't shake a spear loose from a tree that had not agreed to a game. Roose went to the baths to sit and think like a lizard on a rock. Galbart found a bench and a boy to mend a strap for him, and watched the boy mend, and taught him 3 new curses as his payment. The hall breathed different for a while. Davos delivered Stannis's words without starch. He did not dress them. There was in him a lack of pretense so clean it made pretenses around him look dirty. He spoke of bastardy and crowns, of letters sent to lords who would choose if the realm were to be held or broken into 7 banners and a black wind. He did not once say Joffrey's name while the boy was under Ned's roof. He did not once say Cersei's either, though his mouth tightened at one point as if a taste had come up into it he had meant to swallow. "What do you say to a king in the north?" Caitlin asked when the talk turned to the north's patience with southern fires. She had spoken little. When she did, Davos looked at her as if seeing the shape of the stone around the hearth that made the fire useful and not a danger. "I say that a table with 7 legs stands if each is firm," Davos answered. "But if a leg decides it is a table on its own, then all a man has is a board in the dirt, and you can eat on that, but you are eating in mud. The leg may be tired of holding more weight than its share," Caitlin said. Davos nodded with no disrespect. "A board can be made into a boat if a man is cunning and desperate both," he said. "But the sea will judge it. The sea judges everything." Ned felt a relief he had not wanted to admit he hoped for. Here, at last, was a man who knew that words were wood and that the sea was bigger than them. "Tell your lord," he said, "that Winterfell will hear him. Tell him I will not set fire to the north to prove to men with gold what color the flame is. Tell him also that he must recognize there are children in this hall under guest right who are the levers by which other men mean to move me. He wishes to be king by law. Then he will wait for me to make the law safe to sit on." Davos nodded. "He will not like to wait. He will not be king otherwise," Ned said. "He may not be even so." Davos's mouth twitched. "You talk like the sea," he said, "and I do not mean that as an insult." Before the envoy left, Ned had him eat at his table with the gold-haired children present because he wanted to see what the man's face would do when it was asked to sit with a storm in human shape. Davos sat between Tommen and Myrcella as if he had taken a place on a narrow beam and meant to hold his balance without show. Tommen told him he had never eaten an onion that did not make his eyes wet. Davos told him that sometimes onions made a man's eyes wet because the man remembered a ship full of them coming in sight like a saint after a long hunger, not from the onions themselves. Tommen considered that gravely and ate his onion with stubborn care. Myrcella asked Davos if Dragonstone looked like a dragon, and he said no, which disappointed her. But then he said that when the wind came off the sea on a hot day, the rocks smelled like a forge, which delighted her. Joffrey said nothing at all, but he watched the man's fingers and the way he sat a knife back on the table without clink, as if the table were a deck where a clink could wake a sailor who had not slept enough. He filed this somewhere even he did not know he had a place. After Davos had gone, Wendell Manderly stayed long enough to eat a second supper and to give Ned a sense of what the docks felt like in the first snows. Quieter than summer, but holding a hum of readiness like men at the first call to wake. "There are ships, my lord," Wendell said. His mouth made for roast and laughter, and both given in equal measure. "Not enough for war, but no one ever has enough of anything for war. Enough to carry words. Enough to fetch bread. Enough to take iron out and bring fish in. If you wish to speak quickly to a man in the Vale, there is a man in my father's house who knows where to find a gull that will take him there." He wagged his head. "Or he knew last year," Gulls do as they please. Men too, Ned said, and thought of Theon. The letter from Pike came on an ugly day with a yellow sky and a snow that did not know whether it wanted to be rain yet, and so did both and neither, and made the yard oily with slush. The seal was black pitch, and the hand was a scrawl like a line of waves blown sideways in a gale. Luwin carried it to Ned with the sort of gentle care one uses for a thing that may be a venomous egg. Ned read and felt the old shame and the old necessity and the old anger move in their old measures in him. He sent for Theon. Theon came fast and in good temper, which meant he had been trying not to think. He took the paper like a cup and drank and did not hide the wince. "He is a lord again," Theon said when he had finished, trying for flippant and failing. "Or he remembers he was and tells the paper so. I never can tell whether he is remembering or pretending." Ned watched him. "He asks for you." "He doesn't ask," Theon said roughly. "He demands. Always has." He shook the page as if he could shake the words off. "He wants me back to be a son and a seal and a hostage both, and I cannot be all that in the same breath and still breathe." "You may go," Ned said, because the word had become heavy in Theon's ears and he needed to hear it. "You are a man, not a piece of rope. But if you go with the knowledge that I will not have the north burned for the sake of a man's pride on an island where the soil can't be bothered to keep seed." Theon looked up, quick, hopeful, then wary. "You would give me a ship?" "I would give you a letter," Ned said, "and men enough to see you as far as White Harbor or to the Sisters if that's the wind. From there the sea is the sea and will do as it likes." Theon considered. He had the hungry look in him he always got when a horizon showed its rim to him and the itch in his bones that made him want to kick and run. Then he looked at Robb in the yard below through the window, at the boy who was a brother and a lord and a habit both, and the itch quieted a fraction. "He will make himself king again," he said, "or try. He thinks the world has owed him a thing since before he was born." He laughed once without joy. "He should have been born a prince. Then he'd be happy." "No one is happy born a prince," Ned said, and Theon's eyes flicked without willing to the corner of the yard where Joffrey stood with a practiced sword and a mouth set in a stubborn line. He swallowed. "Let me think," Theon said. "A day." "Take 2, Ned said. "Then take the one you can live through." He told Catelyn that night what he had told Theon and watched her face move through worry and relief and the peculiar resignation of a woman who has learned that men believe the sea is not the sea for them. "He will go," she said. "He will," Ned agreed. "Or he will not. The choosing will turn him into the man he will be." Catelyn threaded a needle and bit the thread off clean. "So simple," she said. "So hard." They tried a small feast that night because the snow had been mean all day and men were grumbling, and there is a line between grumbling and cracking that a lord must see and oil with meat and ale before it splits. The tables were crowded and loud. The fire made a sound like a living thing satisfied. Larks preserved in fat came out of a pot with prunes, and there was a relish of cabbage and mustard seed that lifted the meat the way a good song lifts a dull night. Sansa sang because she had been asked and because the hall had grown warm enough in her heart to let the note come. She began with a southern thing and broke it off gently after a verse because the stone did not love it, then found a northern air and set her voice low where it sat well. Myrcella joined the chorus no one knew in this room but which fit the place by chance or long circuitous providence. She did not sing loud but true, and the place where their notes braided was a bridge over a gap that had not been bridged for anyone else yet. Old Nan's mouth tilted, pleased, as if she had been waiting years for someone to find that thread again. Joffrey did not sing. He watched and drank and thought, which was unusual for him in a hall where there was noise to drown that habit. He was a boy who had learned to fill silences with orders. Now he had a silence inside him that men filling the room could not fill. The wood and iron sound of training in the yard would fill it for an hour, then leave it waiting again. He rose once to go and did not, because leaving would have marked him, and he did not know what mark he wanted to wear. The bite came the next afternoon. It was as Osha had said it would be. It was a bite given to test the bone under the skin. Joffrey came into the lower yard in a temper. He thought he had hidden and found Rickon amid a garden of new-rolled snowballs set to freeze, each the size of a man's head. a plan for a war that would never be fought, and so was Joy. Shaggy Dog loomed over one of the balls and mouthed it, growling as if the snow itself had given offense. "What are you doing?" Joffrey demanded. He had had a bad morning at the yard. Ser Roderick had sent him out twice to catch his breath and pushed him twice back in, without pity and without malice. He was not used to being made to do a thing he did not do well. The feeling bit. "Making heads," Rickon said with relish. "For giants. Giants are dead." Joffrey said, "Only fools tell you otherwise." Rickon stared. "Old Nan is not a fool." "She is old," Joffrey said, because he had no other weapon to hand. Shaggy Dog, bored with philosophy, moved to test another snowball. His heavy shoulder bumped Joffrey's leg. Not hard, not hurtful, only wolf and alive and near. Joffrey, who had been schooling his fear for days now and growing tired of school, snapped. He brought his glove down hard across the wolf's muzzle. The sound was small, a wet smack, and big in the place it landed. Shaggy Dog's reaction was as simple as a spring in a trap. He lunged and took Joffrey's sleeve in his teeth and shook once, hard enough to make the boy's shoulder jar, not hard enough to tear the cloth. The sound that came from Joffrey was part outrage, part a child's sound of surprise when the world behaves as it should, not as he had told it to. Osha was moving even as the wolf did. She snatched back Rickon by the collar and put herself between Joffrey and the wolf in the same breath it took Arya to vault the fence. The yard stilled, then erupted in noise. "Off," Arya told the wolf, voice sharp in a way it only was for him. Shaggy Dog hesitated, then spat the fabric and sat, chest heaving, eyes bright. He had a smear of snow on his nose and looked pleased with himself. Joffrey pulled his arm back and stared at the dint his own sweat had made on the cloth. He rounded on Arya. "Have him killed," he said, high and fast. "Have him killed or I'll—" "You'll what?" Arya asked, too soft. "Kill her dog," Joffrey said, stabbing a finger at Sansa, who had just come into the yard in time to hear only that. She stopped. The blood went from her face. For a moment the air around her seemed to bend. The years fell away and she stood in a memory that smelled of horse and river and the cold bright edge of a day that had gone bad. "No," Ned said from the gate, his voice as flat and final as a sword on a block. He did not stride, he did not thunder. He only stood there, and his presence made a shape nothing else in the yard could fill. "No wolves will die in this yard to soothe a boy's pride. Not again. Not ever." The silence after it was so complete a man could have heard a snowflake land if snowflakes made noise here. Joffrey's mouth worked. He wanted to say that he was king. He wanted to say that he could order men. He wanted to say that the wolf had bitten him. He looked at his sleeve and there were no teeth marks, only cloth wet with a wolf's breath. He swallowed. He shook his arm free of the memory and glared. "He attacked me." "He corrected you," Osha said without apology. "For lying." Joffrey stepped toward her as if to strike. Ned did not move. He did not need to. Gray wind had appeared at Robb's knee, and his eyes were on Joffrey, and his body said quietly that there were lines in the world one did not cross. Robb did not speak. He did not need to. Sansa found her breath and, with it, the shape of the day again. She stepped past Joffrey as if he were a piece of furniture that had been badly placed and set her hand on Arya's wrist. "Come," she said, and Arya let herself be drawn a little aside because she had learned that sometimes the thing to be done was not the thing her blood wanted. "Rickon?" Sansa added, and the small boy came too, scuffing one heel, Shaggy Dog bounding at his side without a hint of apology in him for anything he had done. Ned waited until the yard had resumed its breath before he looked at Joffrey again. "You will be bitten again in your life," he said. "By wolves, by men, by the wind. Learn which ones to strike and which ones to step away from." Joffrey turned on his heel and went. He did not run. He did not have that habit. He walked as if nothing had happened, which was almost as good a habit if a boy could keep it and not let the poison from it into his bones. Sansa sat that evening with her hoop in her lap and the thread unthreaded and stared at it as if the empty needle might teach her a thing the full one could not. Catelyn came and sat without speaking and set her own work in her hands and made stitches in a line long enough for Sansa to borrow a little steadiness from it. After a while Sansa said, "He said," and then stopped because she had no interest in making a shape out of that sound and putting it into the air where it might take root. "He is a boy," Catelyn said, and it was comfort and warning both. "He was a boy when," Sansa said, and then stopped again, because one word dragged another behind it like a chain, and she did not want that particular chain in the room again. She set her needle and took a breath that went all the way down. "I want to be the kind of woman who does not cry when men are foolish." "You are," Catelyn said. "You are also my child." Sansa bent her head. 2 tears fell, neat as beads. She wiped them up with a care that would have made Septa proud, and then went back to her work without looking at her mother because looking would have undone something that had just been tied and needed to be left alone a while. The watch sent a man before the moon changed her thin edge for a rounder face. He came on a pony that had opinions about the world and steam coming out of his nose like a little engine. The rider wore black so worn it had grayed to the color of a rook's back at the shoulder blades, and his beard had ice in it like salt. He told his name to the gate and then to the hall, Kedge Whitebeak. It was not the name his mother had given him. He ate and drank and warmed and then told his piece, which was not long but had weight. "There are men missing," he said. "There are tracks that go where tracks don't unless they're made by something that doesn't think about tracks. There are fires we don't set and find burned out when we go back to a place we thought empty. There are noises on the other side of the wall that set your skin to crawling. There are stories the old men half remember that make more sense than they used, and that's a bad thing to say." He looked at Ned without a lot of respect and more honesty than most men carried into a lord's hall. "Old Bear says to send what you can spare for a man to chew. We'll shit it out as men. Or we won't. Either way the ravens'll have bellies." "You have them," Ned said. "And blankets. And oil for lamps, and men, though we are as lean as any farm this winter for the taking. I will not send you boys. I'll take weathered men who remember the taste of fear," Kedge said. "Boys think it's a sweet." Ned gave him men he could spare and a letter with his name and seal on it because paper with such marks on it could buy a man a bed and bread in 5 places where his own face might not. He handed the letter to Kedge with a sense not unlike the one he'd had handing a stick to Joffrey in the yard. "This is not enough, and it is what I have, and you must use it." Bran dreamed that night of the wall, which he had never seen, and of a bird that flew into the wind and did not move and then turned, not by beating its wings harder but by letting the wind do half the work. He saw Jon Small against a white that was not snow but something harder and closer and old, and he saw something move in the shadows that was not a man and not an animal and not a story, and Summer made a sound in his sleep that was not fear because wolves do not call fear by its name but something near it, a readiness, a crouch. Bran woke and the room was dark and warm and smelled of stone and brother. He lay and listened to Hodder's breathing in the other space and to the whisper of the hot water under the stones and to the snow's soft insistence at the window. He went back into sleep like a swimmer going under, calm, knowing the shore was there when he wanted it. In the morning, with white up to men's knees in the outer yard and the sky the color of pewter, a sled came from the south with a flag of red and gold and a brazier set on the bed to keep a man from freezing while men decided whether to let him in. The brazier hissed in the falling snow. The flag was furled. The men on the sled wore red cloaks that had been cut for a warmer place and armor that had been polished by hands who had nothing else useful to do. They had the look of cats on ice, sleek, offended, unsteady. "From Lord Tywin," the first man said with an accent that made the words heavy as cake. "With offers." "With offers," Hallis Mullen repeated to Ned. Not because he thought his lord was deaf, but because saying ridiculous things aloud helped keep them in shape. Ned had them brought into the great hall and fed and sat and watched. The leading man called himself Ser Flemond, which was a name out of a song that had been sung with a grin and a cup in Lannisport for generations. Ser Flemond the Fulsome, who gave words where he should have given work and smiled where he should have put his hand on a blade. This Ser Flemond did not smile so much as he rearranged his lips in an approximation of it. He set a parchment on the table as if it were the head of a stag. It offered gold, of course, and pardons as if pardons were a crop Lord Tywin could harvest and bring to market, and a wife for Robb out of a minor Lannister branch that would make his daughters red-haired and their laughter polite. It offered to call this winter's quarrel a misunderstanding men had taken to the field too quickly over, and it offered a way for the realm to be whole again under the boy whose sleeve had been in a wolf's mouth yesterday. It offered, finally, to forgive Winterfell the insult of having 3 royal children under its roof without a by your leave. The offer had the smell of a man writing what he himself would not swallow, but who has learned to hold his nose and get through it. The great Jon barked laughter that knocked snow from the beams. Roose Bolton looked at his fingernails as if assessing their cleanliness. Wendell Manderly ate a lark with an attention that would have made a priest of the Seven blush. Ned read and then set the parchment down politely, as if it had been a guest who had made an error with a spoon. "Tell Lord Tywin," he said, "that Winterfell accepts gold only when it is paid as a tax or a price for goods, not as a leash. Tell him to keep the wives of his cousins. Tell him his pardon assumes I ask something he has any right to grant. Tell him, lastly, that the children under my roof have eaten my bread and salt and will not be moved by threats dressed as gifts. When roads become roads again, not pits, we may talk as men who have a chance to get their words to their intended hearths before they ice over." Ser Flemund reddened. It was a clean red that sat high on his cheekbones like paint. "Lord Stark, stay," Ned said, "and thaw. You will die within the mile if you leave now, and I do not want your men on my conscience." He glanced around. "Find them furs," he told Catelyn with a look that was request more than command, and she nodded because she read the same thing on the men's faces he did. Southern frostbite, first degree, idiocy. Ser Flemund slept in a room kept for men who needed mercy. In the morning he left with his cloak heavier and his eyes wider and his men's fingers still attached. They did not raise the flag in the yard. They were not fools, only men who had thought the world would bend for their cloaks and discovered it did not. Myrcella found a measure of pity for them in her as she watched them go. Pity is a skill, and hers sharpened with practice. Sansa, beside her, had less to spare. She stood with her hands tucked into her sleeves and said nothing until the sled's hiss had dissolved into the falling white. "What would you have done?" Myrcella asked quietly. "Sent them to the baths," Sansa said, "and then home." She did not say to a home that is unkind, because girls did not say such things about houses that had once promised them golden futures. They only learned to wear fur and to sing songs that fit the stone. Joffrey's training went on not because he had changed, but because the yard did not care if he had. Ser Roderick did not soften because boys grew sore. He did not harden because they grew proud. He kept them in the same grip he had kept 100 before them, and it worked because the grip had been made by a man who had done this for so long that if you pried it open, there were grooves inside where boys' wrists had sat and learned. Joffrey's stance began, grudgingly, to steady. He learned not to overreach where any stick would punish him. He learned, once, to take a blow that would have split his lip and let it slide along his glove and away. He looked up then, quick, to see if Ned had seen. Ned had, and for a moment their eyes met, and Joffrey looked away first. That was its own kind of step. In the afternoons of that week, Catelyn set Myrcella to copying lists for the steward because the girl's hand was neat and she had no vanity in it, and because it let Myrcella see how the house was kept. She saw wood tallied and oil and grain, and men's names put into columns that made sense of them. She liked numbers. They did not flatter. She learned how many loaves fed the watch detachment that had warmed itself and left. She learned how many cloaks were mended and to whom they belonged. She learned that a house is held by small, repeated acts, not by banners, and she grew fond of the steward's complacent ledger and the smell of vellum and the sand that whispered as it dried ink. Tommen, running out of new useful tricks to collect, asked Hodder to teach him how to carry Bran without jostling him. Hodder did not know his own skill well enough to put it into words. He only made the sounds he made and let Tommen watch his feet and the way he took stairs and how he shifted his grip to let Bran's weight lie where the boy could bear it without raw spots. Tommen was strong in the way of children who are not fat but will be if someone does not take their spoons away. He learned to carry not just bran but also buckets and wood and, on a day too cold for outdoors, old Nan's stool to the side of the hearth and back again exactly where she said it should go. Not there. There. No, boy. That there. Good. Arya discovered that Myrcella could sit a pony well and that she had no objection to galloping when asked. This made Arya look at her twice. She had been making a grudging place in her heart for the girl because she had not cried in the baths after the first day and because she asked the right questions in the Godswood. The pony sealed it. They raced in the inner yard the way girls do who pretend they have not become friends and are trying the idea on from the side. Arya won. Myrcella laughed. Arya did not say, "I like you," she said again. Bran's dreams went farther. He saw a river that was not one he had ever crossed, green even under a sky of iron, and a boy on its bank with a face he both knew and didn't, a face that seemed as old as something under the frost and young as something trying a voice for the first time. He saw a hill with a heart at the top of it. He woke and did not tell anyone and was not afraid. He did not have the word for what he was doing. He had the feeling of it. Held. Theon came to Ned with his answer at last. He had not slept, and he smelled of the stables in a good way, like straw and horse and leather. He looked, for once, like a man who had put his laugh away and left it somewhere safe until he could come back for it. "If I go," he said, "he will make me into a thing I don't want to be and a thing that will be useful to him. If I stay, I will be a thing I like better and a thing that will be of use to you. He will hate me for either." "Men will always be useful to someone," Ned said. "The only choice is whether you like the hand that holds your haft." He waited. Theon swallowed. "I stay," he said. The word left him as if it had cut him coming out and relieved the pressure behind it. "He will call me craven. He will call me woman. He will call me false. He will call me words that do not fit, and he will try to make me fit them by force." Theon's eyes glittered with a kind of tears he would not have let fall if the stone had grown teeth and bitten him. "I will not wear his words." Ned put his hand on the boy's shoulder. It had the feel of a thing done that had needed doing for longer than anyone had known. "You will wear mine," he said. "They are few. They are heavy." Theon laughed then without joy, but with some relief in it. "You do not know how to make anything easy, do you, Stark?" "I know how to make a house stand through winter," Ned said. "The rest is for summer lords." Theon bowed his head without mockery. That was new. He left with a step that was lighter than the one he had come with and heavier too, as if someone had put a pack on his back and meat in his belly both. The snow's voice changed a little. It packed differently underfoot now that men knew where to tread to make the most of it. The tracks around the Godswood grew deeper and the ones to the mews grew clearer, and the path to the granary became a trench with walls like white stone. Men shaved the ice on the steps in sheets and sled them to the low place by the outer wall where children used stones to build the beginnings of a fort no one would need and everyone wanted. The ravens flew lower, closer to the line of the roof tiles, and their shadows moved like thoughts across the yard at mid-morning. The sun found a way out between clouds for an hour and burned the ice on a corner of the wall into a glitter that made men squint and remember summer like a pain in the teeth. At night, when the hall had settled into the soft chaos of snoring and the stairs spoke only of mice, Ned and Catelyn lay in the bed that had been theirs longer than any other bed had known them, and they spoke, sometimes, in the dark where words could be put on the shelf and looked at without the eyes taking flight. "Do you wish we had run another way?" Catelyn asked once, meaning with the children south instead of north, or east instead of either, or not run at all and let the city decide. "No," Ned said after a time. "I wish for fewer wishes." She slid her foot along his shin and found a warm place and left it there. "You always wished for fewer wishes," she said. "Even when you were young and I was foolish enough to think that was stubbornness and not wisdom." "You were foolish enough to marry me," he said. "The rest was only practice." She pinched his arm, and he smiled in the dark and did not let it be seen, which was its own kind of kindness. When the next raven came from the south, it carried nothing but a scrap of news so pared down it might have been bone. Renly had taken a crown of summer and thorns, and men had cheered because men liked to cheer. Stannis had burned something he believed in to prove a point about believing. Tywin had set men on the river like a plague of iron locusts. All this came to Winterfell as weather comes to a room when you open a window a hand's width. Enough to taste, not enough to warm by or take shelter under. Ned read and shut the window. He went to the yard and watched Joffrey take a blow and not cry out, because he had learned by now that only cowards and honest people cried out, and he wanted to be neither in a yard full of men who watched. He watched Tommen build a little house out of split logs behind the kitchens and then offer it to a stray cat that refused it because cats have their own designs. He watched Myrcella bind her hair as Sansa had taught her and go into the gods' wood alone and lay her hand on the bark the way the Northerners did and come out with her mouth a little softer, as if she had drunk hot wine. He watched Rickon fall asleep in a pile of furs in a place he had not meant to and be carried tea. Oh, his bed by Hodder as if he were a basket of eggs. He watched Robb lean his head against Grey Wind's neck in a moment when he thought no one saw and close his eyes for the length of 2 breaths and then straighten and grin at Theon because boys needed grins like they needed bread. He watched all of it and found in it the kind of courage he could use. There were other kinds. Those would be asked of him in rooms with flags in, and in fields where men bled into snow and it melted because blood is warm, and on letters where his name would be something other men would try to spend. For now the work was to hold the line of the day. He held it when Davos came back, because in time he did, as a man who knows where he can eat a good onion will always find his way again. He brought no new arguments and no new threats, only a small change in Stannis' words that a careful reader would feel and a less careful man would not. A patience learned from the sea, not from men. He ate his stew and let Tommen ask him if he had ever fallen in, and told the boy that anyone who said he had never fallen in had either lied or never gone near water. He asked Myrcella if she had found a song that fit the stone and nodded when she said she had. With the grave attention a man gives a fact that may keep a ship from wrecking if remembered. He went with Ned to the Godswood and stood and did not speak, because he had learned quickly that this was not a place for talking. He looked at the face in the bark and did not shudder. He put his hand to the water and hissed at the heat and laughed at himself under his breath. He said, finally, "My wife would like this," and then left the words at that, as if a man could hold another house in his hand for a heartbeat and not shake it. "Tell your lord," Ned said as they stood at the edge of the pool and watched one leaf find the water in a slow parabola and lie, "that I will bring the North to his law when I can do so without losing my own. Tell him I have men to feed and children to keep warm and wolves to answer to." Davos nodded. "I will," he said. "He will not like it." "He may not need to," Ned answered. "He needs only to hear me say it and then do his part without flinching." Davos smiled that private smile again. "He is good at not flinching," he said. "So am I," Ned said. He was not sure it was a virtue. A girl who had been left since they left the South. One of Sansa's women who had gone quiet and clever and dangerous in the city and had grown like ivy along the walls there to survive, came to Catelyn and asked to be set to the washing. Catelyn said yes, because a woman who asks for work she can do is a woman who intends to live. The girl's name was Jane. She had gone thin and her hands trembled when she held a cup. The tremble quieted when she lifted a tub and went out into the yard where the air cut trembling away. She had seen kings and their shadows and found herself aligned to walk in a northern hall where steam rose from the stones and men said good morning without fear. Catelyn watched her from the passage and felt the particular relief of a small life saved for a while. It was not a victory that would be sung. It was the only kind she had to hand. Sansa's voice grew stronger. Myrcella's stitches grew smaller. Tommen learned to cut bread with a knife that did not skid on the crust. Arya learned a new way to roll her wrist with needle that would put a point into a place a man believed armored. Robb learned to say no to the Greatjon without making it sound like no, and the Greatjon learned to hear yes where he had thought there was not enough of it. Theon learned to stay. Roose learned nothing and watched everything and smiled rarely and never at men he might need soon. Wendell learned where the ale was kept and did not drink it all, and so learned to be welcome back. And Joffrey learned to take a cut on the forearm without letting his hand open and drop his stick. He learned to stand still for a moment longer when men told him to. He learned, most grudgingly, to apologize to Rickon for frightening Shaggy Dog. He did this in the most parsimonious fashion possible, words like bare stones set in a line across a river. Rickon stared at him as if he had spoken in low Valyrian and then said, "You're stupid." As a way of receiving the apology without accepting it, Joffrey went red. He did not strike. He walked away with his jaw tight, and later that day he saluted Ser Rodrik before a bout in a way that would have been called graceful if any other boy had done it. The snow did not stop, but men stopped looking up every time a flake landed on their sleeves, as if the sky might be making a new choice. The weather had made its choice. The house bent to it. The rooms nearest the baths became coveted and then common. The rooms near the outer walls were given to men who had spent their lives outdoors and liked a draft to sleep by. The scent of onion and wool and smoke was in everything, and when Ser Flemin's men spoke of the south as a place where the air smelled of dust and orange peel, the kitchen girls looked at each other and did not quite envy. There was certainty here, even in cold. The orange was a story. The onion was bread. A boy died in Wintertown of a fever that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with winter. Ned went down and stood with his mother while she screamed, and with the father while he did not, and with the old father of the father who ate quietly and drank what he was given and said, "We plant." In a voice like gravel and grief, Ned sent wood and wool and flour and a man with strong hands and no pride to help with the burying. He came back to the castle and stood under the heart tree and did not ask for anything. He let the hurt tie itself a knot and sit, because that is what it had to do, and then went back in and told Luwin to send bread to the old man next door who had grieved 3 sons and was now left with his daughter-in-law and her children, because grief walks and eats and bread slows it. No one in the hall sang that night. It was not a night for songs. At last, when the moon had fattened and thinned twice more, when the snow had crusted and receded and fallen fresh again, when the dogs in the yard had learned which southern boy would slip them bones and which northern one would not and loved them both, when Davos had gone and come again and gone once more with the letter that said enough and no more than enough, a raven came with a scrap of news that actually made men breathe out and look at one another with eyes that had something to share, besides tales. A parley, real and in a place with walls on 3 sides and water on the 4th, where men who called themselves kings and men who had made themselves kings' tools and men who were sick of both might go and speak into one another's faces without immediately reaching for blades. Ned read and did not smile. Catelyn read and did not breathe for a heartbeat. Roose smiled and did not move at all. The great Jon laughed, the sound like a tree splitting in spring. Wendell asked for more larks just in case. Luwin looked as if the sum he had been struggling over had finally resolved to a neat answer that would not hold for long but might hold for the hour. The children looked only at Ned, because his face would tell them whether to be glad. He let it tell them nothing yet. "White Harbor," he said finally, "or Moat Cailin." "White Harbor," Catelyn said promptly. "Moat Cailin is a trap with walls." "So is White Harbor," Roose murmured. "It is only a trap with fish." "The sea is bigger than any trap," Ned said, thinking of Davos. "Men who intend to leave lies in their wake do not like to go near it." "Then White Harbor," the great Jon declared, as if he had decided it himself because he had spoken last. "And we will stand on Manderley's stone and tell them what is what." "You will stand in Winterfell," Ned said, and the great Jon's mouth opened and then closed because the voice that said it had not been one he had heard since the snow began, and it told him that this was not his day to say no. "I go, with Hallis, with Rodrik, with the law, with no more men than I need to enforce guest right in a hall." "You will take the children?" Catelyn asked. Her eyes went to Myrcella instinctively and then to Joffrey and Tommen. The thought made a tremor in the air like a horse catching a scent. "No," Ned said. "If they are under my roof, they are safe, and not as bait for any man's hook. If I take them, I paint a target the size of the Dreadfort's wall on my own back and dare every bowman south of the neck to try me." "Then you will take singers," Old Nan suggested from the corner where she had become a piece of furniture men forgot to move. "Words keep wounds from suppurating when you cannot bind them." "Gage makes better poultice," the great Jon roared, relieved to be allowed to laugh again. "Singers," Ned said thoughtfully, "and maesters, and bread." "And the truth," Catelyn said. "And the truth," Ned agreed, almost smiling this time, because that was a thing he could carry without packing. He looked out the window at the yard where the children were. One small group there and another smaller there, gold among the brown and black like sunlight trapped in straw. He thought of the heart tree and the baths and the old stone's breath and the way the snow had taught everyone in the house where to step and how often. He thought of the sea, of Davos's steady hands on a cup, of Stannis's angry, unbending script, of Tywin's polite insult, of Renly's crown that would shrink in winter like wet wood left too near a fire. He thought of wolves and of boys, and of girls with needles and songs, and of Theon standing with his laugh put away and his back straight. He went down to the yard and called Robb and told him what he meant to do, and Robb's mouth tightened and then relaxed, and he nodded once as if he were a man and not his son. "I will keep the door," Robb said, simple as a promise. "You will," Ned said. He put his hand on his oldest boy's shoulder and felt the weight there that would only grow. "And I will come back to it." Arya asked if she could go. "No," Ned said, and a small war occurred in her eyes. And then she took the defeat well because he gave it to her in a way that did not shame her. Sansa asked if she could send a song. "Yes," Ned said, and she moved off with a purposeful grace that made Catelyn close her eyes for a heartbeat. Bran asked if he could dream away. "Yes," Ned said and touched his hair. Rickon asked where the wolf would sleep. "Where he pleases," Ned said, and Rickon nodded as if that settled matters. Joffrey asked if he could stand in the hall when the lords came to take their leave, and Ned thought about saying no and then said yes because a boy who wanted to see men say goodbye to a lord and had begun to learn how men did that in the north was a boy who might someday understand the difference between order and honor. Myrcella asked if he would take back a letter to the king in the south with her hand on it. "There is no king in the south," Ned said, and Myrcella colored and then held. "But I will carry your words to the place where men pretend there is one." Tommen asked if the men there had dogs. "No," Ned said, "but there are cats and fish and men with opinions. It is almost the same." The day before they left, the snow paused and the sun cut the yard into plains of brightness and shadow. The wolves sprawled in warmth like spilled ink and sighed as if they had written a book. Sansa sang one of the 3 songs Myrcella had found, and the words came off her tongue like water off stone and left it clean. Theon stood on the wall and watched the road south with a look that was not yearning and not relief and not contentment but something mixed of all 3. A northern wind that had finally decided which way it would blow for a while. Roose went into the baths and did not come out for a long time, and when he did his eyes looked flatter than before, as if the heat had shaved another layer off the man and left a smoother surface with more under it. Ned went to the Godswood alone one last time before he set out, because it was not a thing he could leave without greeting. The pool lay flat as hammered tin. The heart tree watched with the same old, impersonal attention. He knelt because he had never learned a better shape to make with his body when asking for nothing and everything. He did not ask for victory. He did not ask for peace. He asked to see the next step and to have wood to put a foot on when he did. When he rose, Myrcella was there again, not hiding it now, and she did not curtsy because this was not a place for curtsies, and he did not ask her to. She came to his side and stood with her hands tucked into her sleeves and her hair bound well in the northern way. "Will you bring me news of my mother?" she asked, polite and raw at once. "I will bring you truth," he said. She nodded. "I do not think I want that." "No one does," he said. "It is the only thing that stays when the weather changes." She looked up at the carved face and made herself not be afraid of it because she had decided not to be the day she put her hand to the bark. "I like your gods," she said. "They don't ask you to be happy. They ask you to endure," he said. She nodded again because she understood that, and then she said, "I hope you do," and left him because she had learned that you did not keep people in Godswoods when they were leaving. Catelyn went with him as far as the outer yard. She pressed a glove into his hand while the men checked harness and rope and oiled leather where the snow would try to eat it. He turned the glove over and saw a bit of thread tucked in its lining. Sansa's, a stitch done in the pattern she had been working yesterday. A nothing, a charm, a girl's belief that hands could hold men through weather. He tucked it back and met Catelyn's eyes. "I will come back," he said. He did not say, "if I can." "You always do," she said. She did not say, "so far." He kissed her and stepped back and mounted the sled because horses were of less use than men in this snow where the road was more concept than stone, and the runners would do what hooves could not. Hallis Malin took the first position with the set jaw of a man who had a plan for what to do if he had to drag his lord by himself. Ser Roderick shook his whiskers and swore at a strap and then set it and swore again for luck. Luwin pressed a parcel into Ned's hand with the air of a man giving a child a final book for a journey. Ink, paper, sand, a small knife, onions. The last made Ned laugh, and Luwin looked pleased at his joke. They went out under the gate as the wolves lifted their heads to watch, and the children stood like little banners, gold and brown, their faces upturned and earnest. Joffrey stood stiff and pale and did not wave. Myrcella did, once, a small precise movement. Tommen waved both hands as if he were trying to fan the sled forward with his fingers. Rickon shouted, "Bring back fish," because the idea of a harbor was mostly a promise of fish to him. Bran lifted a hand once and then let it fall because lifting it hurt and because he did not want the moment to be like anything else it had ever been. Robb stood with Grey Wind and said nothing and did not need to. The sled runners hissed like quiet snakes. The gate swallowed them. The world beyond was white, and then a long gray where sky and ground married badly, and then a white again where the river showed its bones. Winterfell breathed out behind them, warm and old and living. Ahead, White Harbor waited with its stone and its fish and its men with opinions and its water that remembered everything it had crossed. The wind leaned in with a body to it and took their faces in its hands. Not cruel, only honest. Ned pulled his scarf up and tasted wool and salt and onion where his fingers had been and the ghost of Catelyn's breath. He set his jaw and set his eye on the low place in the far line that would be the road and said, "To no one and to the sled and to the snow and to the gods whose face looked out of a tree at home, one step," and took it. The road was not a line so much as a remembered idea a man could find again by reading the land. The rise that held the wind longer than the dips. The ruts that ice found and made treacherous. The black humps of stone someone had set upright generations ago to guide travelers in storms. The sled runners hissed and clucked. The men bent into their collars. Hallis Malin made a sound in his throat from time to time. Nothing like a song, only a promise to himself to keep his feet under him and his lord on the sled. Ser Roderick's whiskers froze into little spears and then thawed and then froze again, and he cursed them mildly and then let the curses go because breath was a thing better saved. When they came to places where the drifts had curled like the back of a sleeping beast, the men used their shoulders and the sled lifted the way a boat lifts over a swell and then dropped into a trough and went on. They passed hamlets that had shut their doors against anything with a stranger's step in it, and farmsteads that had made themselves into islands with piles of split wood like low walls and goats huddled behind them as if the wood could keep out cold. The snow came thin like sifted flour and then thick like wool and then thin again. A hawk crossed the sky, black and brief. Men waved from porches and some did not wave and some only watched. Ned watched back and counted roofs and smoke and kept a ledger in his head that was all outgoings. Bread, oil, hope. At the ford of the White Knife, the water ran with a slow muscle under the ice and made a sound like a man talking through a door. The ice along the edges was thick enough to take weight. In the center it broke and moved sluggishly and then reformed 100 yards downstream as if to prove a point about persistence. They crossed at the place where the land knew how to do this thing and had taught men to do it too. The runners shuddered. The men did not look down. A fish rose and took a breath and vanished. The breath made a circle that ran outward and was gone. The sled creaked back onto snow and the sound changed underfoot, and the men's shoulders loosened the way a man's shoulders do when a thought he was trying not to have passes. There was a knight at a little holdfast with a square tower set in stone like a tooth and a wall that had remembered how to keep horses out even if it had never been tested by more than that. A woman with hair the color of iron ladled stew into wooden bowls and did not ask for coin because Luwin's letter and Ned's signet were coin, and because a certain kind of woman in the north counts her wealth also in the stories she will tell later of who came to her door in a bad year. Her sons went around with the pot and filled men's bowls twice if they emptied them, and once again if the men looked like they might not stop for sleep but strap on their packs and go out and freeze out of stubbornness. Ned took the second and not the third and slept on a pallet that had the smell of wheat to it still from summer and dreamed that the grain stood tall and green and that the wind bent it in lines that meant yes. White Harbor announced itself first as a taste on the air that was neither iron nor ash nor steam but something sharper. An edge that cut through wool and deep into the lungs and woke them. Salt. Men lifted their heads like dogs taking a scent. The white knife widened out where the city began, and the river's slow old color changed as the sea moved up into it and shook it and made it lively and restless. The walls were pale stone that showed dirt, easily, and had been scrubbed often by men who cared for such things. The new castle rose on its rock with windows like a face watching the harbor and, beyond it, the open water that wore gray as a cloak in this season. On the long quay the masts stood like a thicket. Gulls wrote their names above them and cursed in their messy voices. The wolf's den crouched older and uglier near the water with its scars and its history on show because it had never seen the point of hiding either. They were met by men in Manderley green with white tridents on their cloaks and spears that gleamed even in this light. The men bowed with the courtesies of townsmen who have had to learn what to do at both the king's table and the fish market and not give offense in either place. Sir Wylus himself came down with 3 knights of the Green Fork and 2 fat men whose swords looked well-loved and polished and whose belts told a man they had been lean once. Wylus bowed deeper than the others, and when he straightened the smile at the corner of his mouth was courtesy, and the warmth behind it was something less common and harder to fake. "Lord Stark," he said, and his voice had the edge of the sea on it and the solidness of the land under. "White Harbor is yours." "It is yours," Ned returned, because that was the proper reply in a season when men were trying to claim other men's things with words. "I only come to borrow a room where words can be kept warmer than they freeze on the way out of a man's mouth." "We have rooms," Wylus said. He flicked his gloved hand at the sled and the men with it in a gesture that was not showy and took in all the necessary work. "And bread, and a cook who loves lard like a woman loves silk. My father insisted on both for winter," his mouth tucked. "He insisted on other things for summer. We do not have summer." Lord Wyman Manderley did not come down to the quay because the stairs were many and his knees were what knees become in men, who have put a life's wealth into their tables and their city rather than into their joints. He received Ned in the Merman's Court where the vaulted ceiling had been painted with fish so bright and ridiculous that a man with no poetry in him would have laughed and a man with any would have felt oddly comforted, and where the big pillars had those great, bearded, fish-tailed men carved on them with eyes like coins and smiles like salesmen. "Winterfell's lord," Wyman said, and his voice filled the space as if he had designed it for that work, which he might have. He sat like a mountain in a chair that had been made strong enough for him and covered with blue cloth to flatter his eyes, and his chins lay in their neat ranks like waves on a gentle shore. "When the sea moves, the harbor listens," he said, which could have meant a dozen things or could have meant only one. "When the river swells, the banks hold," Ned answered. He did not bend knee, and Wyman did not ask it. He rose with effort and held out his hand, and Ned took it, and the clasp was firm and surprisingly dry and smelled of lemon because Wyman had always been particular about his hands. "Eat," Wyman commanded, which was courtesy in him as much as command. "Then talk. A man who talks on an empty stomach is either trying to steal or trying to boast. Best to feed him so the words fall into more sensible shapes." They ate. Wyman held court over a dish of pike with a sauce that smelled of something Ned could not name and did not try to. And there were oysters so cold they made men's teeth ache and so briny they tightened the throat. And there were loaves with seeds on them that got into a man's beard and made it a small mess, which cheered everyone. Ned ate more than he thought he would because the sea had a way of opening the appetite and because Wyman's cook did, indeed, love lard and knew its ways. After, with his mouth contented, Ned could speak the clearest words he had. "Stannis sends his man," he said. "We have met him. It seems the sea has taught Lord Stannis patience a little." "The sea teaches everything," Wyman said, reaching for a fig with the careful broad fingers of a man who has learned not to break delicate things. "Eventually. Your city is a bridge," Ned said, not flattering. "We will cross it. Others will come to try." "They have," Wyman said dryly. "The 7 came and left. The Lions sent a letter with 9 red seals and 9 lies. It arrived by way of Sisterton in a sack with a herring that made my maester swear. Did you answer?" "I sent the herring back," Wyman said. and the corners of his eyes smiled as if they had been given that work when the rest of his face had been asked to do too much of something else. It was the only honest thing in the bag. Later, in a chamber with tapestries of ships and mermaids, whose smiles were too wide for human faces, and a fire that had been stoked to a ferocity unnecessary for health and appropriate for comfort, Davos came. He arrived as he had arrived at Winterfell, plain and neat and with a smell of rope about him, his black beard showing a new thread of white for every storm between the city and the harbor. He bowed and waited and did not immediately open his mouth, which was a kind of speech itself. "My lord," he said, when Wyman had waved him to a seat with the trailing hand of a man whose other hand is taken up with balancing himself. "My king sends his right," Wyman finished for him, warmth in it, "and asks for ours." Wyman looked to Ned as if the sea and the land must pass the cup back and forth and not spill. "Shall we give him the Norths, Lord Stark?" "We'll give him the laws," Ned said. "That's all he's asked for." "And if a man comes with both law and fire?" Wyman asked gently, surprising in his sharpness for a man built of stew and song. "Then he is confused," Ned said. "Or he means to make the law into a torch. The law is wood. It holds. It burns if you ask it to do the wrong thing." Davos's mouth twitched, which was his version of laughter when he chose to keep the sound to himself. "He will not like the song you sing, my lords," he said. "He will respect it. He will not like it. He thinks songs ought to be about truth and steel and a crown that sits lawful. He says if a man cannot find truth, he will make it." "Cersei makes truth," Wyman said, plucking another fig with concentration. "She bakes it and men eat and find themselves burned in the mouth and ask for more because it is sweet." "We are not wolves who believe sweetness is poison," Ned said. "We are men. We must be more careful than that." They spoke until the candles burned down and the lamps guttered and the servants came in with more oil and went out again. They spoke the terms a city could endorse: safe conduct for White Harbor's ships, the protection of the Black Cloaks by royal decree that would be paid for with more than ink, the end of the burning of God's houses, the recognition of Torrhen's kneeling as the law's old shape and not a leash to be pulled. Wyman nodded at intervals and made a little stack of agreements on the table between them, as if he were balancing a small model of the realm out of bread heels and fig stems. Davos took down the words without flourish because he was the kind of man who would bring them to his master without adding salt or removing it. The sea was in him in that. "Will you come south?" Davos asked when the little structure on the table looked stable enough to stand for an hour in a strong wind. "When there is law to walk on and not only ice," Ned said. "I will not put the North into a fire I did not light to make a point about fire." "He'll say you want the crown for yourself," Davos said, not doubting, only stating a thing they would both hear from other mouths in other rooms. "He can tell the sea that," Wyman said with a pelican's chuckle. "The sea is generous with crowns. It puts them on men's heads and then takes them away and gives them to fish." Davos stood to go and then sat back down because he had remembered something that had been pushed aside by fig and fire and large men talking like churches. "There is one thing," he said. "Lady Melisandre, the Red Woman," Wyman said, distaste pulling like thread through his voice, "believes the North would warm to a new god if the right wood were burned." Davos finished, apology in his throat. "I told him," he added, quiet as if speaking to just his own hands, "that would like that here would mean blood in the snow and the loss of men he will need. He is not a man who likes to be told. He is a man who learns, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast." Wyman's eyes went heavy-lidded in a way that looked like sleep and was not. "I have taken oaths at 2 altars in my life," he said. "One smelled of incense and the other of sap. I will not burn either because a woman with red eyes says that smoke is a ladder. The sea does not climb ladders. It eats them." Ned said nothing for a moment and let the words sit like stones and find their places. "Tell him," he said finally, "that if he puts fire to any heart tree north of the neck, he will have a war in the snow that will not end until the dead stop walking if they mean to. If he finds he wants such a war, he may start it without me." Davos bowed his head. "I will tell him," he said simply. He looked tired, and not only from the road. He will not like it. He will have to learn, Wyman said, and unexpected pity moved under the words like a slow fish. Men who want to be kings must learn what they do not like. They set a parley for the morrow in the merman's court, not with the men who needed to be humbled by each other's cloaks. The lions had no ships here, and Renly's storms were for summer pages, but with the men who could actually make a thing happen. The lords of the White Knife's hills whose herds and men would move if told. The captains whose gulls could deliver messages quicker than half the ravens. The bailiffs and beadles and customs men and dock bosses who would make the North's strength into bread for black men in fur. It would be a small council with more power in it than banners. It would be almost what Ned wanted, which was all any day would give him now. He slept on linen that had been aired and smelled of lavender because Wyman refused to let a lord of Winterfell smell only of smoke and sweat in his house. He dreamed, stupidly and sweetly, of Arya chasing a gull along the quay and nearly pitching into the water, and of Myrcella laughing, and of Joffrey standing under the carved merman's stone stair and trying to outstare it. He woke with the taste of salt on his tongue and the decision already made in him to hold as long as he could before he moved anything that would send boys into iron. Winterfell breathed without him and did not stop. Catelyn made certain of it. The day after the sled had vanished under the gate, she went up to the wall walk and stood where she could see everything. The yard where Ser Roderick's whistle cut the air like a small, precise knife. The mews where a boy with bad ears had learned by watching the pinches of Luwin's fingers to trim jesses. The roofs where men knocked ice away before it grew heavy and dangerous. The kitchen yard where steam rose over the snow in ropey coils. She could not see the Godswood from there. No lookout in Winterfell lets you see all of Winterfell, but she did not need to. She felt it as a shape against her back, steady as a hand on a shoulder. She went down and walked and watched and spoke and listened and made the house's tone where Ned had made its pulse. The little fire happened the day Wyman poured cream on a berry tart and called it summer. A lamp in a passage near the granary had been poorly trimmed by a boy whose mind was on a girl. It flared, then guttered, then caught a stray wisp of straw and made a lick of flame that had more hunger in it than its size. The boy slapped at it with his sleeve and made it worse, as boys do. The heat found a crack and crept in like a thief and was suddenly 3 rooms away. By the time the smell reached Catelyn's nose, she was on the stairs and speaking without raising her voice. The line formed not because she rang a bell but because the house was taut. Water, buckets, rope. Theon took a place in the yard with a line of men and a chain of leather buckets that flew hand to hand in a rhythm like soldiers chanting and then like heartbeats. He shouted twice and laughed once and swore often, and it had the tone of a man who had chosen where he toiled. Ser Roderick drove 3 boys back with the flat of his sword when they tried to crowd the corridor, and then sent them round to clear the lower stairs because smoke falls, and boys never remember that until they learn it in their lungs. Sansa collected the littles, the ones too young to be useful with buckets, and took them to the lower hall and set them to telling her the longest story each knew. She sat on the floor with her hoop put aside and listened as if each story mattered as much as any song. When one child saw the smoke and began to cry, she put his head against her shoulder and hummed a tune with no words until the crying became hiccups and then those became nothing, and she kissed the top of his head and did not mind that his hair smelled of tallow. Arya took the kennel boys and the girls who were not littles and marched them to the yard and set them to filling buckets at the cistern and carrying them to the line. She did not tell them to be brave. She told them to keep their feet because she had learned that nothing fells a line faster than 1 pair of heels where they should not be. She put a bucket in Tommen's hands, a small one for his size, and said, "From me to Hodder," and Tommen nodded solemn and did it with care. When he slipped, he did not cry. He swore in a peculiar little voice and corrected, and Arya saw it and nodded to him and to Hodder both, and that nod lightened Tommen like a spoonful of sugar. Joffrey was there in the pack at first only because noise draws boys like blood draws flies. He watched with his mouth a thin line and his eyes hot because fear burned in him, and he did not know what to do with it if he could not order it. He stepped toward the line and then away and then back. He opened his mouth twice and nothing sensible came out. He did not like that. Then he saw Theon laugh and lift 3 buckets in turn as if they were no more heavy than a girl's hair and hand them to men up the line and not care who those men were or what they thought of him. And something caught in Joffrey's throat that felt like anger and was not only that. He stepped into the line a little down from Theon and took a bucket from a boy with chapped lips and passed it to a man with a scar and got out of the way for the next and then did it again. It lasted as long as such things last. The smoke thickened and then thinned and then went away. The smell stayed. The granary did not burn. 3 sacks of grain had singed and were thrown out with curses and regret. The boy who had trimmed the lamp stood in front of Caitlin with his hands clenched and his mouth trembling. She told him he would not tend lamps for a week and would stand in the cold and watch a man more careful than he trimmed them, and that he would think of heat while he was cold and remember. He nodded until his neck ought to have broken and then fled to his post with gratitude as if it had been a feast. The house breathed, counted itself, found all its parts present. When word of the fire reached Joffrey's chambers late that night, because gossip is a weather that moves like its own river, he said nothing. He sat on his bed with his back very straight and looked at the wall where a shadow lay from the lamp like a lance braced for a charge. He had the smell of smoke in his hair and under his nails. He considered calling for hot wine and did not. He considered pulling his glove off and looking at the welt his practice blade had left on his palm that day and did not. He sat, and after a long time he lay down and he did not weep, and the not weeping was not pride this time, only a boy learning that the world will not make space for his tears the way it will for his feet if he puts them in the right place. Myrcella wrote the letter to her mother with Caitlin looking on because it was proper that a lady see a child through the first of something that would matter. She chose her words with care not because she feared to anger her mother, though she did, but because she wished to speak truth and not temper it so much it ceased to be what it was. She wrote of snow and of songs and of baths she had learned to love with a fierceness that surprised her. She wrote of Sansa's stitches and Arya's wolf and Tommen's onions and a wolf taking Joffrey's sleeve and no blood. And she wrote, very small, that the gods' wood was not to be mocked, not here. She did not write, I am safer here than I have been anywhere else in my life. But the shape of the words lay under the ink, and Caitlin saw them and did not weep either for that. Back in the harbor, the parley was what parley is in winter. Men with cold noses trying to make words warm enough to live. The captains came with salt on their boots and Wyman's petty officers with wax tablets and clever fingers. Davos stood at one end of the long table with his hands behind his back like a sailor at attention on a deck he loved. Ned stood at the other with Hallis Malin at his shoulder like a pillar, and Wyman sat and did not sit as how it looked because his presence filled the place so that he might as well have been moving even when he was not. They agreed to small true things that would make larger true things easier, that a Manderley cask marked with the Merman in white would be let through any blockade Wyman could bribe himself into by men who understood that starving black brothers made for poor law, that letters with Ned's name on them would be honored in salt pans in Duskendale and Gulltown if they had a second mark on them that Davos would teach to his sons and no one else, that men in black could ask for bread in any port and be given it and only called traitor by fools. They wrote it all down because men forget anything not carved, and paper is carving for people who live in towns. They sealed it with 3 seals, a trident, a wolf, a crowned stag's fiery heart that made Wyman's lip curl and kept his hands steady regardless. When it was done and men had drunk the cup that says we've bound ourselves to this for as long as it takes to wash the taste away, Davos asked to walk the quay. He did not belong indoors as long as other men did. Ned went with him because the cold bit less at the water's edge than a hall could buzz when a thing had been decided and everyone wanted to arrange the words in their own order. I had a son, Davos said quietly, not as a confidence, only as a fact a man might lay on a table to weigh down the corner of a map that wants to lift. He died, on the Blackwater, when green fire taught us all its lesson. Ned did not ask which. He had learned that grief is larger than names. I had a sister, he said, surprising himself a little. She died in a bed with flowers by her hand and the smell of blood in the air. The flowers were a lie any man could have read if he had chosen to, and most men did not. We lie to ourselves where we can. Winter is a poor liar. It will teach us honesty if we live long enough for it to bother. The king I serve, Davos said, with no irony and no mockery and no apology for using the word, believes the truest teaching comes with heat and iron. I think this winter may teach him there are other lessons that last longer. He is a hard man. Hard men can be used for good. They do not like it. They would rather be used for hard. He looked out at the gray where the river played at being sea and the sea let it. He will hold a law if he takes it in his hand. He will not sit a table of lies as that boy would. He did not need to explain which boy. The gulls did it for him, crying and bickering in ridiculous voices. Then we will give him a law to hold, Ned said, and we will try not to break the fingers of the boys who must live under it. When he left White Harbor, it was with buckets of salt fish, sacks of onions that made Hallis Mullins swear cheerfully about the smell. A sheaf of papers with 3 seals twisted tail to tail that Lewin would take delight in and Wyman's blessing like a blanket. Not holy, only warm and heavy and reassuring. Sir Wyllis rode with them as far as the second mill and then stopped at the stone marker where, in summer, wildflowers hid and now only drifts lay, and he embraced Ned like a cousin and went back to his city to count fish and men and see where he could make one into the other. The sled bit the snow and rose and fell and sang to itself. The wind had shifted just enough to move the drifts into new patterns and to lay men's tracks from 2 days past a yard to the right of where they had been. Hallis grunted and bent, and Ned knew the satisfaction of trusting a man without needing to speak the trust because the work spoke for him. Once they saw a band of men on foot moving west, 6, then 8, then 10 as the white let them appear one by one. They carried spears and bundles and the look of men who were going home to whatever roofs could be coaxed into being there. They did not come near the sled. They did not shout or wave. They looked up and looked down and did not hurry. The world had too many moving pieces in it for anyone to go toward one without thought. Near evening on the 3rd day, at a place where the road lowered into a hollow and the wind died enough a man could hear his own boots complain, they came on a sign nailed to a pole that had once been a young tree. A flayed man, painted in a red that looked freshly wet. The paint had not run because the air was too cold. The sight did not bleed, only sat and watched their approach. Ser Roderick made a sound in his beard that was as contemptuous as a cat's sneeze. Hallis spat and missed only because his lip was too stiff from the cold. Ned looked at it and did nothing because there was nothing to be done that would not require men he did not have and a fire he did not want. "That's not for us," Hallis said. "It's for people who don't know where they stand. It's also for men like us," Ned said. "So we remember that the man who set it up will set up others and then come and take them down himself if someone objects." He looked a little longer, not giving it the courtesy of any more attention than a man would give a dangerous dog at the edge of his yard. "Cut it down," Hallis did with 2 economical strokes of his axe, and let the painted board fall into the drift and be swallowed. The pole stood like a bone. They did not take it down. It would have meant digging, and night was moving. They made Winterfell before true dark because men who know a road in their bones gain an hour that other men miss. The gatehouse gave its old bark of welcome. The chains, the rattle, the roll, and the breath of the hot water rose to greet them like a ghost coming out of the body of the earth. Children's voices carried. Wolf's low talk happened under the bench like a household noise. Ned felt something in his chest loosen that he had not known was tight. Catelyn met him in the yard with her hood up and her mouth stern and her eyes unmoved, and then moved when he took down his scarf and she saw his face. He told her all of it in the time it takes to walk from gate to hall. Wyman's bread, Davos's words, the little marks on paper that might save men in black from starving, the red woman's smoke, the painted red on a board. She took it as she took everything in winter, steadily counting, making places for each in the house of her head. "Supper," she said when he had finished, "because there is always supper in a house that means to stand." He went to the hall and the breath of it made his skin prick as if it were hands. The first thing he saw was Joffrey at the lower end of the table, sitting with a posture he had learned and could now hold for the length of a meal without looking strained. The second was Sansa's mouth curled slightly in, hiding a smile that had happened without her permission. The third was Myrcella's eyes, steady and golden as coins that have been handled so long they have no edges left to tear flesh. Tommen had a smear of something on his chin. Onion, pumpkin, Ned could not tell, and he wiped it away with such care when he caught Ned's glance that it made a small, foolish well of sweetness open in Ned that he did not resent. After the eating, after the talk that mattered and the talk that did not and the talk that did not know which it was yet, after old Nan's story about a man who promised her a spring in the middle of winter and delivered a frost that killed the last of her chickens and still she called him friend because he had tried, after Rickon fell asleep in a posture that would have broken a grown man's spine and had to be lifted by 2 boys and a wolf, after the wolves wrestled in the corner and did not knock anything down because they had learned the hall's lines, Ned went to the Godswood again because a man with a habit should keep it. He did not expect company. He was surprised to want it. He found Bran there with Summer at his back and Osha with her elbows on her knees and her head tilted in that way she had when she was listening for things other people could not hear, and sometimes she could not either and only pretended. Bran had a calm on him that looked like a coat a man put on when he had learned how to wear it finally. He nodded once. He did not say, "I dreamed you on the quay." He did not need to. Ned sat and watched the water lie and the snow fall, and for a little while there were no kings in the south or the east or the west, and there were no red women, and there were no flayed men on poles, and there was no need for anything but breath and the old tree's eyes. When the letter came next from Dragonstone, it had more white around the words than before. Stannis's hand had not grown less rigid. It had learned to leave space. He did not say he agreed with everything. He did not say he relented. He said, in his way, that the law would hold where it touched the north, and that no god would be burned there by any hand he could command, and that the men in black would eat bread bought with his coin until such time as they could stand a wall without shaking. He said, at the end, without ornament, that the boy with the lion's hair in Ned's hall was a sore that ought to be lanced, and he left the sentence unfinished. It was as much trust as a man like that could send by bird. Ned read it and felt the odd ache of recognizing a fellow stone. A second letter came on the same bird, lighter, the hand less browned by sun and more schooled by ledgers. Wyman's. It spoke of ships he had sent out and would send and what their flags would be, and it spoke of a sailor who could be trusted to carry words in the belly of his boat as if they were gold, and it spoke, in a last line, of a pie he had eaten that reminded him of a summer in a house he had not lived in for 30 years and made him cry a little. Ned smiled for that and then did not, because smiling at Wyman's tears felt like a thing a man did indoors and not out in the winter. Joffrey stood in the yard the next morning with his stick and did not ask to be spared the cold. Ser Roderick made him go through the drill that had become his habit, and he did it with only 3 glances toward Ned and 2 toward the door where warmth promised an easier day. He took a blow on the thigh and turned the pain into anger and then turned the anger into better footwork. It was a clumsy alchemy and it worked. Tommen cheered for him quietly and Arya did not, and Sansa looked away because she had learned when to look away and still see what she needed to, and Robb nodded once, the nod of a boy who had learned that other boys' improvements were not his own victories and yet pleased him as if they were. Myrcella, finished with her morning's numbers for the steward and her hands cramped in that particular way that comes from making careful letters, went to the Godswood again and sat and watched the water, and then at last she spoke, not to the tree but to the air. "Please," she said, and it might have been to any of the gods in the world, or to none of them, or to the season itself. "Please let us be the kind of people who don't break." The heart tree said nothing, as it never did. The water moved. Somewhere in the hall, Olden sneezed, and the sound carried oddly. In the yard, wolves snapped at one another and were satisfied. There was work to be done. There would be more letters. There would be men at the gate with banners and men at the back door with their hats in their hands. There would be one kind of hunger and then another. There would be the sea's opinion and the laws and the snows, and none of them would be the same and all of them would have to be heard. There would be a day when Ned would have to choose between keeping the gold-haired children under his roof and sending them back into a lion's mouth because that would keep 100 other children alive another season, and he would have to live with it or not. There would be a day when Stannis would ask too much and a day when he would ask exactly the right amount, and those days would not be the same, and a day when Renly's crown would slip on somebody else's head, and a day when Tywin's men would find themselves without enough iron to make their lies stand up. For now there was this. Bread, salt, smoke, stone, old water and older trees, wolves in the yard, children who were learning, men who were holding lines that had been drawn by mothers in kitchens and by fathers in halls and by gods in bark. For now there was winter and the slow work of not breaking. For now there was the next step, and Ned took it, and then the one after that and the one after, until the day went down and the day came up and the house held. The mornings settled into a shape the house could trust. Before the light came clean into the courtyards, the snow had its own pallor, and men's breaths appeared and faded in even measure, and the sound of the first buckets drawn from the cistern made a hollow music. When the light did come, it came thin and distant, a guest at the far end of the hall. Between the watch whistles and the rasp of broom on stone, Winterfell found itself again each day and put on its duties like old clothes. Not pretty, comfortable. A raven with black wax woke the hall one such morning with its peevish, insistent voice. Luwin took the tube off with careful thumbs and broke the seal with his nail. He did not move as he read, which was how men knew to be quiet. Ned saw the slight lift in his chest at the third line and the way he held his breath to the end. "Castle Black," Luwin said when the words let him. "The old bear writes that Benjen Stark's horse came back riderless in the first freeze. They have found a man's hand, black with cold. They have burned it, and it did not smell like burning meat." Men swallowed. A dozen conversations began and died without making it past teeth. Ned took the letter and read the thing he already knew he would read. The thing Jon had started telling them in smaller words. Cold moving with intent, a hush that belonged to no storm, a sense, in old men's bones, that a story was finding its feet again. The old bear asked for what could be given. Food, oil, repairs to a watchtower a storm had taken down, iron for nails, men if there were men to send whose bodies would be worth their bread. "We have some obsidian in the old stores," Luwin said, ticking off with his finger from memory a list he kept like other men keep prayers. From Bear Island trade, from a time when men liked their knives black and brittle for the look of them, not the use. "It is unworked." "Work it," Ned said. "Mikken will curse and then be pleased. Send every man in black who passes a dagger of it and a pouch besides. It breaks sharp." He looked down the table. "Galbart, send men to the Wolf's Wood to look for the glass in the earth." The children of the forest had a liking for it. They brought it to the surface and left it where the rains have not taken it. "Ask Osha where to dig. She knows more of where the land eats and spits." Osha's head came up from her trencher. She had a ham hock in one hand and a dog at her knee. Both wolf and woman were pleased. "I," she said simply, "south of the great oak with the split crown, and in the old barrows where the mounds don't sit right." Roose Bolton watched that exchange over the rim of a cup with his lids so low his eyes were a line of pale water. He said nothing. The great Jon grunted approval as if Ned had suggested a brawl. Wyman Manderly's nephew made a note. He would have a man down at the docks by nightfall telling captains to bring up any black glass they found in ballast. Later that day Luwin brought a different letter, this one not sealed at all, only wrapped around a bit of stiff reed leaf and tied with a thread of marsh grass. It had traveled with a gull to White Harbor and from there in Wyman's sleeve. The hand was small and tidy and old-fashioned. "Greywater Watch does not move for men," Catelyn said softly, smiling despite the cold. "They make men move for it." "Howland Reed," Ned said, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the baths find his chest. He read the letter aloud because some names belonged in the air. "Ned of Winterfell," he read, and the address sounded like a story beginning. "The neck is watching. The bog does not burn for new gods, nor does it freeze for old kings. If you would have the Crannigs at your back, send word by the path that does not take writing. I will send my reed and spear under your roof to bind the word between us until our feet meet mud." "What path is that?" Theon asked, curious as a boy who wanted an answer he could brag of later. "An old one," Ned said. "Not for boats, for breath." He folded the letter and put it into his sleeve and went to the Godswood because some messages had to be answered under a white face, with winter on the tongue. At dusk, 2 figures came to Winterfell with the wind at their backs and wet at their hems. They did not come by the King's Road. They appeared near the little gate by the weirwood as if the Godswood had breathed and let them out. The men on the wall had not seen them cross the yard. They had frog spears wrapped in leather and nettles caught in their clothes and a smell of peat about them that was not unpleasant. The girl was 15, maybe long-limbed and light, her hair a tangle of brown rope, a net bag at her hip and a knife tied low on her thigh. The boy was younger and quieter, green eyes too old for his face, moving as men move who have learned to listen to the ground before they put a foot down. "I am Mira Reed," the girl said boldly to Hallis Mullen's question. "And this is my brother Jojen. We bring gray water into your stone. Our father sends us." She pushed back her hood and grinned. She was not pretty and did not know it and would not care if told. "Have you frogs?" "I've been 3 days without frogs, and if I go for I might die." Gage took this as a challenge and not an insult. He had eels and onions in a pot before Mira had finished stamping snow off her boots. Jojen stood in the doorway of the hall and did not go in until Summer had delayed the length of 3 wolf breaths and then stepped past him with a shrug as if to say, "It's safe." He walked as if his feet knew where they belonged without his eyes telling them. Bran watched them as if he had been waiting for them, which he had not known he was. Mira saw him and smiled the grin she had, frank and easy. Jojen only bowed his head the smallest degree and looked at Summer, and Summer looked back, and something quiet happened between them that the room did not hear. At supper, Ned stood to welcome guests, as he always did, and found himself saying a different kind of words. "Mira Jojen of Greywater watch under my roof," he said. "Bread and salt. This is a hard house for southern feet, but for Cranigs the stones are good." He had a memory in his mouth, the taste of an old year and a tall tower and a friend who had fought like a snake and another who had died. He did not give it to the room. He kept it in his jaw and chewed carefully. Mira ate as one eats after marsh work, efficiently and with gratitude. After the first bite tells the mouth there will be more. Jojen ate as birds do, head tilted as if listening to something else, sometimes not moving for a full minute and then taking a spoonful with precise intent. They spoke little. They watched everything. After the bowls had been cleared, Mira stood the frog spear she had wrapped in oilcloth upright and leaned it carefully within arm's reach as if it were a friend. Arya stood up across the hall and took Needle out from under the bench with her own sort of courtesy. The 2 girls looked at each other with the recognition warriors have. "You can do a thing and you know it." "Show me," Mira said, friendly and teasing as if she meant to steal secrets for the fun of having them. Arya showed her the water dancer's first form, needle low, step delicate, breath quiet. Mira laughed outright. "Like a fish," she said, delighted. "Now catch this." She tossed a hoop in the air that no one had seen her take from anywhere and flicked the butt of the spear through its center so quick and light the string fluttered as it passed. Arya's eyes went narrow and bright. They moved into open space and began to teach each other without anyone having to name it. A frog spear's smothering circle against a thin needle's bite, a feint for a shoulder answered with a lower step set in muck, a leap that would have been careless on dry stone made clever by a snap of the wrist that tugged a foot away at the last instant. Joffrey watched the play at the edge of the hall with his hands in fists that he did not lift. Men shouted encouragement. No one shouted for him without his ordering it. He felt it in his throat, hot. He also felt the thing that had been happening to him, a small, incremental patience that had begun life as stubbornness and had turned into another beast entirely, one that waited and watched and did not break if a thing did not bend immediately. He saw Arya's blade slip, once, in a way he would have mocked before. He saw her correct without humiliation. He found himself, quietly to no one, pleased for her. He did not know what to do with the feeling. He let it stand in him and did not kick it out. Later that night, when the hall had fallen to its low voices and the walls had stopped reflecting back sound to make company for the lonely, Jojen slipped soundless into the godswood and stood looking at the heart tree's face as if peering through a lattice. Bran was there with Summer, who dozed with his nose tucked under his tail. The snow fell in a sift that made no sound at all. Jojen said nothing at first. He did not have a shape for the thing he carried that would fit any man's ear. After a time he said, "I have dreamed you." Bran did not say, "Me too." He only nodded once as if the dream were work to be acknowledged and not put on a shelf. "There is a wolf," Jojen said softly, "with snow on his back and a chain at his throat that is made of hair, not iron." Bran's neck prickled. He did not look over his shoot, or toward the place where Joffrey slept. "He bites," he said. "He will bite worse if the chain is pulled too fast," Jojen said. "And there is a fish," he added after another small space, "with a knife in its belly that was put there by its own hand. It swims very slowly and does not bleed. It should be dead and is not." "That is a stupid fish," Bran said. His own voice surprised him by being fond. "The fish is very fat," Jojen said gravely. "It floats and does not drown." He looked off toward the south, toward the stone of the hall and the steam, as if he could see through both. "There is also a man made of snow who is the shadow of a man made of iron, and he stands on stones that move, and his feet are wet even when the weather is dry. He wants to hold fire by the wrong end. He will learn." Bran thought of Stannis and the letter with black and white in it like ice, and red rumored around it like a scarf. He rubbed Summer's ear and let the dream sit in the air and begin to melt on its own. "Will he bring the fire here?" "No," Jojen said, as if he had sniffed the weather and found that it would not rain. "Not unless the old wood lets him. The old wood is older than fire." Meera took to the yard as if she had been born there. She laughed when the Great Jon challenged her to bring down a hare with her spear at 20 paces and laughed again when she did it, letting the shaft go with that same easy, elastic whip of the wrist that made men watch her hands and forget to watch her feet. She slept close to the wall and did not mind the stone. She bathed in the hottest of the pools and came out pink and shining and swore she would bring her father to taste it one day and watch him weep and call it blasphemy and then build a hut in the gods, so he would not have to leave. Sansa found she liked Meera, to her own surprise. The girl's laughter was not a mockery of songs but a celebration of another kind of music. It did not sting, it fizzed. She had the easy touch with a child that Sansa aspired to, and when Rickon barreled at her like a thrown log, she took the impact and rolled with it and came up with him on her shoulders, crowing like a hero in a puppet show. When Meera sat at the table with her net and showed Sansa how to tie a knot that would hold a weight without biting the rope, Sansa saw at once how it could be used in seam and sleeve alike. "You make all things useful," she said, which was a compliment in a house like this. Meera only shrugged. "Useful keeps bellies," Meera said. "Pretty keeps eyes. Sometimes you can make a thing that does both." Tommen attempted the net with a seriousness that put his tongue out of the corner of his mouth and had the kennel girls watching him with the fondness women reserve for boys who are trying to do a hard thing with steady hands. When he had a square the size of his palm complete, Meera took it as if it were worth its weight in gold and said she would carry a frog in it and think of him each time the frog did not get away. Tommen swelled with a wordless pride that made him want to run and sit and cry and laugh, and he ran instead, and then tripped over Shaggy Dog and ended in a heap that made Meera laugh again and Tommen too. Wintertown needed justice like any village in bad weather. Men steal in snow because their children's bellies speak louder than a lord's law, and the law must answer without turning thin, and the children must be fed without promising every thief a picnic. Hallis Malin came into the hall with a man in his midst one day when the sun had offered a little pity, and then changed her mind and gone behind gauze again. The man's nose was running, and he had salt crystals in his beard, and he could not look up from his boots. He had taken a sack of oats. The miller's wife had seen him and thrown a pan at his head, and then dragged him by the ear to the beetle who had dragged him by the other ear to Hallis. The sack had been returned. It had spilled. Children had cried for the oats as if they were apples. "Bring him," Ned said. The room went shaped at once for judgment, benches moving the way bodies move when Serge and Eddie are familiar. Joffrey stood to one side without being told and tried not to show he stood there because he wanted to. Sansa sat with her hands tight in her lap because she hated to see men punished and she loved to see the law hold, and the two were cousins who quarreled in her chest. Arya leaned like a boy against the pillar, face unreadable, seeing and learning. Myrcella sat with her head high and watched in that particular way she had that was not prying, only attentive. Tommen's mouth made a small sad O for the man's running nose. Ned asked the questions he always asked and got the answers he expected. A sick child, a man out of work because the road to his place of work had become a joke the weather told too often, a pride too stiff to ask a neighbor who would have given, a shame too fresh to hide. He sent the man to work 7 days breaking ice from the stairs and the troughs and the gutters, and to eat in the hall, and to take a sack of oats back to the miller that would be paid out of the castle store. The man wept, not at the work and not at the eating, but at the part where he was told to take the oats openly and go home with his head up. Ned watched him go with the knowledge that this was justice in winter and not in summer, and that he had given away a thing he could not afford, which he would do again. When the man had gone, Joffrey said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice that wanted to be harder than it had gotten, he said, "You should have cut off his hand." Ned looked at him. "Whose child should I have taken with it?" he asked, and Joffrey flinched as if the question had struck him. Ned did not soften. "Men will lose hands in my yard," he said. "They will not lose them to make a point about me." Joffrey went away from that and did not slam the door. He went into the cold corridor and stood and breathed, each breath a tidy puff. He did not like the feel inside him, the way the world had made a shape he had not chosen and fit him to it. He also did not hate it utterly. He could not find words for either thing. He went to the yard and hit a post with his stick until his arms shook, and then kept hitting it until they steadied again, which was a lesson he had not known he could learn. The attempt to take the lion cubs back came on a night that tasted of iron. Snowfall had slowed. The air had gone clear enough to sting. Men were inclined to believe the world loved them again when the stars were bright, and such nights made fools brave. The three men came up the outer lane by the smithy, their boots wrapped in rags to muffle sound. They wore the clothes of drovers and had the posture of men used to carrying more than what they had on them. The first had a saddlemaker's callus on his hand and a knife under his jerkin. The second had a sword he did not know how to carry without telling it as much. The third had nothing in his hands and murder on his mind. They had help. The man who opened the postern for them had been bought with coin and a promise of a boat that would carry him to a place where his debts were only the seas. He had a wife who had died 2 years past and a son who took to gambling in grief and a habit of believing promises made when lips are numb. He opened the door and the cold came in and the men with it, and his life shrank to the size of his own fear. Theon found them first not because he had been set to guard that door, but because he often walked where he had not been told to in the hours between midnight and dawn. They were the hours the sea had lived in him, and they were the only thing that made sense to him inland. He had a hand on a flask and a joke ready for the next man he met when the draft from the postern moved over his face like a cold hand. He stopped because the house taught its wards to feel the breath of a change. He set the flask on a sill and moved without thinking about moving, his feet light on a rug that had been beaten clean yesterday and would be again tomorrow. He took the corner without touching the stone and saw the three men in the narrow run of starlight from the half-open door. Their eyes shone fox-bright. Theon smiled a smile with no teeth in it. "You've chosen a poor night to visit," he said, soft. Not a shout to raise the house, only a voice for the men to look at while the rest of Winterfell gathered itself. He could hear gray wind moving already, that thick, silent padding that set hair up along a man's arms like cold. The first man went for his knife, the second for his sword, the third for Theon's throat. Theon ducked, and the third's fingers clutched air. Theon's head cracked into the man's face by accident and good fortune. There was a wet sound and a cry cut short. The knife came fast, faster than an inland man would have believed, and scored Theon's sleeve, then bit leather. The sword came out badly and hit the wall and rang, a foolish, loud complaint. Theon laughed, not because he was unafraid, but because the laugh steadied his hands and he had learned to love steadiness more than safety. Gray wind hit the second man from the side, and there was no more sword. Hallis Mullen came from deeper in the corridor with a lamp, and the lamp made the world sharp and showed the blood on the floor. Hallis had a club in his other hand, and it found the first man's wrist with a noise that meant work for Luwin. The door slammed, the draft stilled. Robb arrived not long after with men tumbling after him like logs rolling downhill, and Ser Roderick's whiskers bristled like bracken in winter, and Theon was laughing still, and then he was not, because he saw the man who had opened the door, and the man saw him, and Theon's laugh went out like a candle. They bound the three and dragged them into the hall where men could see one another and the fire's light could sort faces into categories: fear, anger, pity, calculation. The postern man fell to his knees without being told and put his bruised forehead to the stone and said he had thought he was buying a new life. Ned looked at him for a long time. He did not hurry punishment. He watched a man run out of words and sit in his shame, and then he said very soft, "Guessed right." And the word moved like wind through a wheat field in the room. It rippled and showed a pattern. "Let the three wear the black," Ned said. "If they can get there." He turned to the man who had opened the door. "You will go with them as far as Moat Cailin and take from me a letter with my name on it. You will carry that name to the marsh and show it to the Crannogmen, and if they take your letter for scrap and your body for bait, that is their choice. If they see a man who was a fool and would live, that is yours." The man sobbed and nodded and sobbed again and nodded again, the way men do when they are not sure if they have been spared or sentenced. The three Southerners looked at one another with the fear of men who have just learned there is a place worse than the inside of a northern lord's cell, and that is the road to a wall where a name is shed like a skin. Joffrey watched from his place and thought that it would have felt better if someone's hand had come off. He also thought that he would prefer to go to the wall than lose a hand, which told him something about himself he did not want to know. "They came for you?" Arya said later that night to Myrcella in the corridor, where the air had turned heavy with the fear that follows danger, the thick, metallic smell of it. "They came for all of us," Myrcella said. She had not cried. She had helped Sansa get the Littles to a safe room and barred the door, and then counted them again and did not shake until afterward. "It is not so bad," she added, with the graceless bravery of a child. "They didn't get in. They will come again," Arya said, because she had learned that is what men do who want a thing. She was not being cruel. She was practicing truth in her mouth because it tasted worst at first and better after. "Good," Myrcella said unexpectedly. "Then we can be ready." The next raven from the south carried 3 pieces of paper and 3 different smells. Renly's was perfumed with something that wanted to be a rose and was not. The words on it were easy and friendly and not to be trusted because they had no sharp edges at all, and things thrown at them would slide off without biting. He said he had 1,000 knights and 100 lords and a crown that shone as bright as summer, and he would share them with anyone who laughed at the same jokes. Stannis's was plain as bread. Lists of ships taken into service, men sworn by law, traitors named, fires put out and fires lit. Cersei's was red-waxed and sweetly phrased and galled like a spur. She demanded, she requested, she pitied, she promised. She said the girl, her daughter, must be returned because the world would weep for the laundry if a princess washed it. She said the boys, her sons, must be returned because the stars looked right when they were in the sky and not when they were stolen. Ned wrote what he always wrote, that guest right was older than kings and that Winterfell would not be the place it was if it bent for a mother's tears. He wrote to Renly that tables were not built for laughing on but for eating at, and that the North would not stand to be asked to sing when the song was only a cover for marching. He wrote to Stannis that the obsidian was being worked and the wall fed and the law would hold, and he wrote to Jon that a Frogspear girl had arrived who would teach Arya to leap like fish and that Summer liked a boy who watched the air as if he were reading it. The Crannogmen took the 4 men into the marsh and did not drown them. The road to the wall was as hard as any punishment that had ever been invented, and it remade men like a forge remakes metal or broke them. One of the 3 died of cold 2 days north of the causeway and was buried with his hands bound because Hallis was not fool enough to give him back his wrists even in death. The postern man did not run. He carried Ned's letter in his breast and put his hand over it more often than he knew, and when Howland reads small, Rye people looked at him from behind their paint and their duckweed and decided not to spear him in the belly but show him where the water was shallowest. He thought he had been given a life twice over and did not know yet what to do with it. Roose Bolton, in council 3 days after the attempt, observed in a voice that made the word observe sound like the work of a knife. If Winterfell becomes a snare to catch lion cubs, there will be more rats looking for the cheese. The Dreadfort is more central to my lines. Fewer doors, fewer drains, Catelyn said, lightly, which in her mouth was sometimes sharper than iron. More flaying, my lord? We do not hang our hospitality on hooks here. Roose smiled with his lips. We hang it on pikes, then, to be seen from far. The God's Wood is our pike, Ned said. The white face is enough for those with eyes. He did not look at Roose for more than a breath. He did not look away too quickly. He let the man be seen noticing being seen and leave it at that. The day Stannis' second raven came with the promise that no heart would burn in the north while he needed northern swords, and Stannis needed northern swords. Ned set Meera and Arya to bringing in a boar with the men of the hunt. The snow lay crusted and firm that morning. The sky wore its poorest cloth. The boar left broken geometry in the white that a child could read. Mira laughed for joy at the sight of it, at the simple fact of an animal that would fight a tree for moving in front of it and then astonish itself by living afterward. Arya's breath steamed and she watched the dogs fan out, her eyes bright with the same admiring hunger she showed when Steel sang right. Joffrey begged to go and was told no, and begged again and was told no a second time. He did not beg a third. That night he went down to the kennels and sat with the hounds quietly until one put its cold, wet nose in his palm and sighed in that way dogs do when they have discovered a new hand they approve of. The kennel master saw and did not comment, and later told Ned he had seen the boy sit an hour without kicking anything for boredom, and that was a fact worth filing next to other facts, not a flourish. Tommen had gone too, earlier, and had left the place smelling of laughter and dog. It was a place where boys could put their hands into warm coats and remember a world without crowns. Mira brought back the boar with men, a little bloodied, and Arya, with a rip in her sleeve she did not mind. The beast was massive and ill-tempered even in death. Gage made of it what he could and used the rest to flavor pots that fed men for days. Theon took a tusk, scraped it clean, and hung it on a thong at his throat like a sailor's talisman. Joffrey asked for nothing. He watched Theon's hand as he worked the tusk and said, "What does it keep off?" "The sea," Theon said. His smile was real and showed a bit of the boy he had been before his name became a tool in other men's hands. "And fathers." Joffrey accepted the jest into the air and let it fall. Later he went to the yard and practiced the cut Ser Roderick had shown him for a man who came high on the right with force. It was not a king's cut or a boy's, only a piece of habit he had started to use when fear came and needed working off. Bran's dreams turned, as dreams do, to find new angles on old rooms. He began to see the Weirwood's face in other places. The curve of the merman's beard in White Harbor echoed in the heart tree's mouth. The old stones of the crypts hinted at in the ice along the trough. He woke one cold pre-dawn with a taste in his mouth like metal and the sure knowledge that if a certain raven came with a certain kind of letter, he must not let Arya see it first. He told no one that. He told Summer, who listened and did not answer because wolves remember in a different part of their bodies. A letter came from the Vale on thin, expensive paper, with a scent trapped in it like a woman's sigh. Lisa Arryn wrote that the Eyrie was safe as the sky and that only fools chose to walk roads when they could live on heights. She wrote that her son was delicate and her life was valuable, and that she would not place either at risk for men who had put their own children in the jaws of wolves. She wrote the word brother without heat and without cold, as if it were the name of a servant. Catelyn read the letter 3 times and very carefully folded it along the crease and tucked it away and went into the yard and walked until her face had gone what the wind would make of it. When she came back in, she told Sansa to show Myrcella the trick of keeping a hem neat over boots so the snow did not chew it. She did not speak of the Vale at all that day. A week wore itself thin and then thick again. The days shortened. The hours near the hearth grew longer. Old Nan found stories none of the children had heard and told them as if she had been saving them for a winter when they would be most needed. One night she told of Harrenhal burning and the way black stone can melt and keep the memory of flame forever, and Myrcella listened with her hands hidden in her sleeves and a look that said she felt the heat on her own palms. Another night she told of the pact with the children and how a knife of black glass had once been worth more than gold. When she said that, Jojen looked up and met Bran's eyes and nodded once. Then the morning came when the snow fell with flakes so big you could watch the lace in their centers before they landed and dissolved in a blink. The sky was N.E.R. The sound of the world had been wadded. Even the wolves stepped softer. Lewin's bell called them to the solar, and they went with the obedience of men and children who had learned that bells meant things other than meals now. Ned stood with a paper in his hand. His face carved into that expression he had that was not striking and not smiling and contained both in equal measure. "From Riverrun," he said. "Ser Edmure held the fords and then did not." The words were simple. The ache under them was not. "Lord Hoster is worse. The Lannisters have made an island of every village they pass and then burned the bridges." Catelyn's mouth tightened. A tiny, private movement that most men would not have seen. The Great John swore as if someone had cheated him at dice. Wendell Manderly stopped chewing for a full breath, which for him was a sign of crisis. Roose did not move, which for him meant thought. Ned, read on. There will be no army out of the Trident unless we put it there. The river lords will bleed in their own fields and call it farming. Lord Tywin has sent a word that says he will have his blood back out of our soil. He believes we have taken a thing he grew. We have, the great Jon said cheerfully. 3 of them. We will not give them to him, Catelyn said, her voice very low, and it had the force in it of a thing that had been decided long before any of them had been born. We will not, Ned agreed. We will send men carefully, where men will not be lost to snow faster than to steel. He looked to Galbart and to Hallis and to Ser Rodrik. Not south of the Neck, to Moat Cailin, to the Fever River. To the Mott's men will rally to because they have always rallied to them, Old Stones, 7 streams. He named them like prayers. My lord, Roose said, soft as linen. For every man you send a boy to count him back. Winter hides dead men in a way summer does not. The sums must be kept. They will be kept, Ned said. He knew who to put to it. Myrcella would copy lists of names she had never heard before and keep them neat. The steward would add marks when men returned with all their fingers and when they did not. Sansa would sew angels on the corners of blankets that would go south on sled runners to boys whose mothers would never see the work. Arya would steal bread from the table when no one watched and take it to the armory for the men who worked late there. Tommen would haul wood and think himself Nat the woodcutter out of the tale and do good work because of it. Joffrey would. Ned looked at the boy. Joffrey would practice his cuts and wear his anger like a cloak and stay. Sometimes staying where you were when the blood moved south was a kind of courage men did not sing about. Ned would teach him that without saying it and see if he learned. They sent the first small wedge of men a day later, and Mira and Jojen went with them as far as the bog path where a boy may be a better guide than a map. Mira turned and waved her spear in a figure 8 and was gone into scrub, and Jojen stood very still and then was simply not where he had been because the marsh had made a place for him that stone could not see. The men who went with them had nets and knives and a few pouches of black glass that Mikken had wept over and sworn at and finally shaped into edges that would be as good as any edge until they were not and then break and leave a new sharpness to use again. They had bread with seeds in it and smoked fish that tasted of White Harbor's larders and the odd onion because Wyman had sent them in such numbers that even men who did not think they wanted onions found them in their packs. The day after they left, a brown bird came with a message that had neither red nor black wax and was sealed only by the weight of its own folding. It smelled faintly of smoke and stronger of horse. The hand was cramped and hurried and as direct as a thrown stone. "Robb," Catelyn said under her breath when she saw it. But it was not. It was the Blackfish's, the old, clean stroke of a man who had written orders in the rain and did not fancy flourishes. He wrote that Riverrun would hold as long as its stones could be kept hot and its arrows dry, and that men like Ser Mark Piper and Carol Vance were doing the work of 10 and would die of it if someone did not give them a wall that could be relied on. He wrote that the Lannisters had learned to bring wood to winter and were learning now that wet wood will not burn for all your prayers. He wrote that the Riverlands had begun to pray to the sea, and that made him laugh, and he drew a little fish next to the word as if to insult his enemy with a child's joke. Ned sent him back a line that said only, "We are moving. The Neck will be a jaw for them to break their teeth on." He put a small mark in the corner that meant Howland Reed was awake and that salt had been counted with bread. The Blackfish would understand. Men who had fought together once did not need many words to find the shape of the other's plan. Sansa's new song fit the stone in a way that made old Nan nod and Wyman Manderly's nephew wipe his eyes and pretend he had grit in them. She sang of the river frozen and then a fish moving under it, slow and deliberate, while men on top broke the ice and fell through and were rescued by the same fish they had wanted to spear. It was not a true story. It was the truest she had found. Myrcella took the higher thread and held it without pride, and Arya did not sing and wished to be impatient with the whole business and could not be because it did a thing to the air that made even her shoulder muscles relax as if someone had called them off duty. Joffrey walked in the yard afterward and did not think of swords for the length of one circuit of the inner wall. He thought of a fish under ice and whether it was intelligence that kept it alive or only the water's own will. He thought of a boy at the wall, a bastard, and whether he would die before the rest of them could settle any crowns, and to his own surprise he hoped not. He did not know how to write such a thing into a letter that would not look weak if it were found, and so he did not write it at all. He hit the post again and made the cut come right twice in a row, then 3 times, and let that be his prayer. Theon wrote to his sister and burned the letter, and then wrote again and burned that too. He did not write a third. He went with a small party out onto the skirts of the wood to look for the black glass, and came back with 2 lumps and a story about nearly putting his foot through a crust that looked like stone and was only snow, and he told it in the hall with a mind to laughter and got it, and he slept well that night and dreamed of ships and did not wake with his mouth full of salt. It did not feel like peace. It felt like breath taken carefully between strokes. It felt like bread rationed and onions counted and the old stories being used like maps to keep men from putting their feet wrong in the snow. It felt like boys learning to do men's work and girls learning to do work that had never had anyone's name on it and doing it anyway. It felt like wolves in the yard who did not yet know what they would have to kill. It felt like a house that would not break unless someone decided to break it and then found they could not by themselves. In the crypts, the stones sat their patient watch, iron across their laps, cold and impossible to trick. Ned went down with a lamp when the moon was a sliver and counted, as he sometimes did, because numbers steadied him. He stood before Ricard and Brandon, and the men whose names had become songs men added dirty verses too, and the ones who were only a line in a ledger where a maester had written, died. He did not say prayers to them. He said, "Tell me if I am wrong," and waited, and the silence that answered him had warmth in it this time, which was as much as a man could ask. He came up to the Godswood and found Jojen there again, hands open, eyes half closed, as if he had been hearing something for a long time and was deciding what to tell it back. "The man with the iron face is choosing," Jojen said, as if to himself. "He will choose in a place where a great fish with a crown on its head is carved into a table." "Tully," Ned said. "He will choose law over love," Jojen said, and his mouth did not know whether to smile. "And that will be love for a great many men, and not for the ones under his roof." He looked up at Ned, not unkind. "You and he are alike as 2 knives off one grinder. Duller each time," Ned said. "Sharper where it matters," Jojen answered. Mira sat with Arya by a window later that day, mending a net with thread Sansa had waxed for them, and told a story about a lizard lion that had tried to eat a marsh king's daughter and had fallen in love with her teeth and let itself be speared and had died smiling. Arya said it was a stupid story and loved it and tucked it into her pocket to keep with the better ones. Myrcella asked what a lizard lion looked like, and Mira said, "A Lannister," and then was mortified at her own joke and then laughed, which made it not a knife, only a charm. Another raven, another weight. Stannis wrote that he had taken inns along the road to King's Landing as if they were keeps and made the men in them swear to law, and that he had burned a man who had killed a mother with child to get the inn for himself. He wrote the word burned as if it were metal. Ned read it and put the letter aside and did not write back at once. He went and looked at the children and then at the wolves and then at the sky and then at the tree, and only then did he put quill to paper and say that a man who would be king must keep his iron hot but his hand cool, and that there was a difference between taking a brand to a man who had murdered and taking it to a god's face. He did not write please. He wrote, "Remember the winter you are in." He sent the letter with Davos's mark in the corner because he trusted the man to read words and hear what was under them. In Wintertown a woman had a child too soon, and the child lived, and the mother did too, because the midwife had hands that were like posies in summer and steel in winter, and the house sent a basket with honey and salt and a loaf and a blanket with a direwolf stitched at the corner, Sansa's neat angle to it. The woman cried when she saw the wolf and then laughed through tears and said she would name the child for something not so dangerous, and Catelyn said, "Name him for bread then." And the woman clutched the loaf to her breasts as if it were the child she had not expected to keep and said, "Bread." And everyone laughed and then stopped because it was better to cry. Ned thought, as he often did in those days, of Torrhen in the snow with his hands empty and the sword left in the sheath, and men behind him who could not eat steel, and men in front of him who would set fire to fields they did not own. He thought that men who called him craven had eaten bread grown on fields not burned and drunk water from wells not poisoned, and would again if the gods were kind. He thought that there were other kinds of courage than the one that could be seen from a mile. He thought that he would teach that to his sons and to the son who was not his, and to the girls, and to any man who would listen. The morning the first little band of men returned from the marsh with feet like raw meat and faces like men who had seen things older than men. The yard lifted in a kind of cheer that was too tired to be loud and too real to be quiet. They had cut 3 men out of the bog who were trying to take winter south by standing still in it. They had found 2 lumps of black glass as big as a child's head. They had discovered that the reed people could vanish while you were looking at them and make you smile about it rather than fear. Mira kissed Arya on the cheek without asking permission. Arya threw her arms around her with a fierceness she would not have applied to any southern girl. Not even Sansa when she was small and easy. Jojen stood with Bran and said nothing. Summer rubbed against his leg and left wolf hair on his trousers, and Jojen smiled because he did not mind. Ned took the handful of obsidian and held it in his palm and thought of a black knife in a story, and of a wall under northern stars, and of a boy with a laugh at the corner of his mouth that could be turned into something else if he lived long enough. The glass was cold. Could cut a finger open with less effort than a lie. He put it back into the bag and nodded to Luwin, and Luwin made a mark in his book and said, "Good." The way men say it to themselves when a small true thing has been added to a page covered in noise. And so it went. Letters and wolves, bread and law, boys and spears, a god's face and a woman's needle, a fish under ice and a king on stone, and a boat between them that would carry words as far as the sea would let them go. Snow fell. Snow stopped. Fire burned and was banked and burned again. The house held. The men in it learned to hold with it. The children under its roof grew in ways that summer would not have forced upon them, and did not seem to break any of them yet. The wind leaned in. The old stones drank warmth and gave it back. Somewhere far south, men argued about crowns. Somewhere far north, something older than either watched the sky and listened for the sound of iron. In the middle of it, Winterfell breathed, and Ned walked the yard, counting, and took the next step, and then the next.